Japan's mountains did not merely divide land, they divided authority. Across much of the archipelago, steep ranges, dense forests, and narrow valleys restricted movement, limited agricultural expansion, and constrained the reach of centralized power. Long before the emergence of formal military classes or codified doctrines of warfare, these environmental conditions shaped how conflict was conducted at the local level. In regions where large armies were impractical and state oversight was minimal, survival depended less on massed force and more on knowledge of terrain, concealment, and timing. The foundations of what would later be recognized as shinobi practice emerged from these structural realities. Japan's physical geography is defined by fragmentation. Approximately 70% of the landmass is mountainous, with arable plains confined largely to coastal regions and interior basins. During the Kofun period, beginning around the 3rd century CE, political authority was concentrated in fertile lowlands such as the Yamato Plain. Beyond these centers, particularly in inland Kansai regions like Iga and Kōga, communities remained geographically isolated. Archaeological surveys in these areas revealed dispersed settlements, limited monumental construction, and a relative absence of direct elite oversight. These conditions fostered local autonomy, not by ideological design, but by logistical necessity. Records from the Kofun and Asuka periods indicate that early Japanese warfare was not uniformly organized or centrally directed. Burial mounds, weapon deposits, and fortified village sites suggest localized defensive planning rather than coordinated national campaigns. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of hilltop enclosures, watch points, and natural choke points used for surveillance and early warning. These features are especially prevalent in mountainous districts, where small groups could control access routes without engaging in open battle. The tactical emphasis in such regions favored ambush, withdrawal, and evasion over confrontation. The limited availability of arable land further reinforced this pattern. Competition for resources intensified disputes between neighboring communities, particularly in marginal environments where expansion was constrained. In these settings, prolonged open warfare was economically unsustainable. Instead, raids, night attacks, and targeted disruption of supply or leadership proved more effective. While these actions were not yet conceptualized as a distinct profession, they reflect adaptive strategies shaped by geography and subsistence pressure. Conflict was episodic, localized, and dependent on intimate familiarity with terrain. During the Asuka period, as the Yamato court began adopting continental administrative models inspired by China and Korea, efforts were made to extend centralized authority through legal codes and provincial governance. However, the reach of these reforms remained uneven. Mountainous regions such as Iga and Kōga were difficult to tax, police, or garrison effectively. Contemporary court records, including early administrative compilations, reveal gaps in enforcement and inconsistent reporting from these areas. The result was a persistent divide between formal state ideology and lived political reality. This uneven state presence had direct military consequences. Without permanent garrisons or aristocratic landholders, local communities organized their own defense. These arrangements were not feudal in structure, nor were they centrally coordinated. Instead, they relied on collective responsibility, shared risk, and practical skill. Knowledge of seasonal movement, forest cover, and hidden routes became essential. Over time, these skills were refined and transmitted across generations, embedded within local culture rather than formal institutions. Archaeological patterns support this interpretation. Unlike elite burial sites associated with court-affiliated warriors, material remains in regions like Iga and Kōga emphasize utility rather than display. Weaponry is modest, fortifications are minimal, and settlements are designed for concealment rather than projection of power. This suggests a defensive orientation shaped by vulnerability rather than ambition. Records indicate continuity in these patterns well into the early medieval period, reinforcing the long-term influence of geography on military behavior. Importantly, this stage of development does not yet reveal a distinct class identifiable as shinobi. There is no evidence of specialized uniforms, exclusive lineages, or formalized doctrine. Instead, the roots of shinobi practice lie in a broader landscape of local adaptation, where communities developed practical methods to manage conflict in the absence of strong external control. These methods were widely shared, situational, and closely tied to place. By the end of the Asuka period in the early 8th century, Japan had not yet entered the era of sustained internal warfare that would later define medieval politics. However, the environmental foundations for irregular tactics were firmly established. Mountainous regions remained semi-autonomous, local defense traditions persisted, and the skills associated with concealment and reconnaissance continued to evolve outside elite military culture. These conditions laid the groundwork for the emergence of non-aristocratic military traditions in subsequent centuries, as political authority fragmented and conflict intensified. Before continuing, viewers who value long-form, research-driven history are invited to subscribe to the channel and enable notifications for future Nightfall documentaries. You may also leave a comment noting which section you found most informative, as this helps guide future research and episodes. Espionage entered Japan not through legend, but through bureaucracy. Long before the term shinobi appeared in historical language, the Japanese state had already recognized the strategic value of intelligence, deception, and reconnaissance. During the 7th through 10th centuries, these practices were documented not in folklore, but in official court chronicles and administrative records. What later generations would mythologize as secret arts were, in this period, practical tools of governance and warfare. The earliest sustained references to espionage and deceptive tactics appear in state-sponsored texts such as the Nihon Shoki, compiled in 720 CE, and the Shoku Nihongi, completed in 797 CE. These chronicles, modeled on Chinese dynastic histories, were designed to legitimize imperial authority, yet they also preserve evidence of covert military practices. Records indicate the use of scouts to gather intelligence on enemy movement, informants embedded among rival groups, and deception employed during both internal rebellions and frontier conflicts. These activities were described functionally, without the suggestion of a distinct social category devoted exclusively to such tasks. This period coincided with significant cultural and intellectual exchange between Japan and the Asian continent. Through diplomatic missions to Tang China and the Korean Peninsula, the Japanese court imported administrative systems, legal codes, and military theory. Among these influences was classical Chinese strategic thought, particularly texts attributed to Sun Tzu. Although there is no direct evidence that the art of war circulated widely in Japan during the early Nara period, its principles, emphasizing intelligence, deception, and indirect engagement, are clearly reflected in recorded military behavior. Court scholars trained in Chinese learning transmitted these ideas through education and policy rather than through independent martial traditions. According to court records, intelligence gathering was embedded within formal command structures. Military expeditions often included personnel tasked with reconnaissance, message interception, and assessment of terrain. These individuals were not named or celebrated, suggesting that their role was considered auxiliary rather than prestigious. Their importance lay in function, not identity. This distinction is critical for understanding the historical roots of shinobi practice. Intelligence work was a method employed by the state, not a profession defined by lineage or secrecy. Archaeological evidence from this period supports the textual record. Excavations of administrative centers and frontier outposts reveal systems of watch posts, signal fires, and guarded routes designed to transmit information quickly across distance. In Kyushu, for example, defensive installations linked to fears of continental invasion demonstrate early warning systems reliant on observation and communication rather than direct confrontation. These structures indicate that the Japanese state invested in intelligence infrastructure, reinforcing the view that information was considered a strategic asset. During the 8th and 9th centuries, as the Ritsuryo system attempted to standardize governance across the archipelago, the gap between central policy and provincial reality widened. Provincial governors were responsible for maintaining order with limited resources, often relying on local knowledge and informal networks. Records indicate that intelligence gathering increasingly depended on local intermediaries who understood terrain, population movement, and regional politics. This reliance marked a gradual shift from centrally directed espionage to more localized practices. By the early Heian period, the imperial court's direct control over distant regions weakened further. Military obligations were commuted, conscription declined, and provincial elites gained autonomy. In this context, covert tactics did not disappear. Instead, they became decentralized. Without uniform oversight, intelligence functions migrated away from formal bureaucratic structures and into the hands of local power holders. The practices persisted, but their organization changed. Importantly, there is no evidence from this period of independent schools, hereditary espionage families, or codified systems resembling later shinobi traditions. What existed were adaptable techniques applied pragmatically in response to specific challenges. Later historical memory would retroactively assign these practices to a distinct identity, but contemporary sources do not support such a classification. By the 10th century, Japan stood at the threshold of profound political transformation. Central authority remained symbolically strong but operationally limited, especially outside the core regions. The techniques of intelligence, reconnaissance, and deception, once managed through imperial administration, had become tools available to local actors navigating a fragmented landscape of power. As imperial authority weakened, these practices decentralized further, setting the stage for their expansion and specialization during the centuries of conflict that followed. Where the court's reach ended, local power began. By the late 10th century, the authority of Japan's imperial government had weakened substantially beyond the capital region. Administrative systems designed to impose centralized control proved increasingly ineffective in distant provinces, particularly in mountainous and marginal lands. This erosion of court oversight marked a decisive shift in how security, land ownership, and conflict were managed. In its place emerged localized systems of power that relied on self-organization, collective defense, and practical military skill. During the late Heian period, the Ritsuryo state continued to exist in principle, but its mechanisms no longer functioned uniformly. Tax exemptions granted to temples and aristocrats expanded private estates, or shon, which were increasingly removed from direct imperial administration. Estate records and legal petitions from this period document frequent disputes over boundaries, harvest rights, and jurisdiction. These conflicts were rarely resolved by imperial intervention. Instead, enforcement depended on local actors capable of protecting land and resources through force or intimidation. As central military conscription declined, responsibility for defense shifted to provincial elites and village-based groups. These individuals, often referred to as jisamurai, were not members of the high aristocracy, nor were they full-time professional soldiers. They were landholders and managers who combined agricultural production with armed protection. Temple archives and estate documents indicate that these groups organized armed retainers and militias to guard property, escort goods, and retaliate against encroachment. Their authority rested on proximity and capability rather than official appointment. Conflict in this period was rarely large-scale or formally declared. Instead, it took the form of raids, ambushes, and targeted attacks designed to pressure rivals without provoking wider retaliation. Records from estate disputes describe night incursions, destruction of crops, and intimidation of laborers. Such actions required careful planning, intelligence gathering, and familiarity with local terrain. Success depended less on numerical strength and more on timing, secrecy, and coordination. These practices reflect an increasing reliance on covert methods as practical tools of competition. Archaeological evidence from rural fortifications supports this interpretation. Excavations reveal small-scale defensive works, ditches, palisades, and concealed access points, designed for limited engagements rather than prolonged sieges. These features suggest an emphasis on deterrence and rapid response rather than territorial conquest. In many cases, such fortifications were integrated into existing settlements, reinforcing the close relationship between daily life and security. Temple chronicles provide further insight into the use of covert tactics. Religious institutions, despite their spiritual authority, were major landholders and frequent participants in disputes. Records indicate the employment of armed agents to monitor rival movements, intercept messengers, and conduct surprise actions against opposing estates. These activities were framed as defensive measures, yet they relied on the same principles of concealment and information control that would later characterize organized shinobi practice. Importantly, there is no evidence that these militias operated under a unified identity or shared doctrine. Techniques varied widely by region, reflecting local conditions and traditions. However, the repeated use of similar methods across different provinces indicates a broader structural pattern. As the imperial center lost its capacity to enforce order, local actors filled the vacuum with systems of security rooted in immediacy and adaptability. By the 12th century, these dynamics had reshaped Japan's political landscape. Power increasingly resided with those who could mobilize force locally and manage information effectively. The imperial court remained symbolically central, but practical authority had shifted outward. The techniques of intelligence, reconnaissance, and sabotage, once administered through bureaucratic channels, were now embedded in regional military culture. These developments did not yet constitute organized shinobi communities in the later sense. However, they established the institutional soil from which such groups would emerge. Local militias had normalized covert tactics, transmitted practical knowledge across generations, and demonstrated the effectiveness of information-driven conflict. As Japan entered an era of sustained civil war in the following centuries, these local traditions became formalized, expanded, and increasingly specialized, shaping the future of irregular warfare in medieval Japan. Warriors learned quickly that victory required information. With the establishment of the Kamakura shogunate in 1185, Japan entered a new phase of political organization in which military authority became the primary mechanism of governance. This transition fundamentally altered how conflict was conducted and managed. For the first time, a warrior government ruled in parallel with the imperial court, administering land, justice, and security through military officials rather than civilian bureaucrats. In this environment, intelligence gathering emerged as a practical necessity rather than a supplementary tactic. The Kamakura Bakufu governed through a decentralized network of vassals, or gokunin, who were granted land rights in exchange for military service. This system extended warrior authority across the provinces but also introduced structural vulnerabilities. Loyalty was personal rather than institutional, communication was slow, and regional conditions varied widely. Administrative records indicate that maintaining order required continuous monitoring of local power dynamics, estate disputes, and potential rebellions. Information, therefore, became a form of control as important as armed force. Military chronicles from this period, known collectively as Gunki Monogatari, provide insight into how warfare adapted to these conditions. Texts such as the Heike Monogatari describe the use of scouts to assess enemy positions, terrain, and morale prior to engagement. While these accounts are literary in nature, their repeated references to reconnaissance and deception reflect practices consistent with administrative documentation. Together, these sources indicate that intelligence gathering was increasingly recognized as a formal component of military planning. As samurai governance matured, a clearer distinction emerged between open combat and covert operations. Open battle remained central to warrior identity, emphasizing personal valor, mounted archery, and public displays of allegiance. However, practical considerations often required alternative approaches. Records indicate that nighttime movements, surprise attacks, and infiltration were employed to compensate for numerical inferiority or unfavorable terrain. These methods were not celebrated in the same manner as open combat, yet they were widely used when conditions demanded. Administrative documents reinforce this interpretation. Legal codes and estate records reference messengers, informants, and guards responsible for monitoring boundaries and movements. Although these individuals are rarely named, their functions are clearly delineated. The absence of personal recognition suggests that intelligence work was considered utilitarian rather than honorable, yet indispensable. Its effectiveness lay in discretion, not visibility. Archaeological findings from Kamakura period sites further support the growing importance of intelligence. Excavations reveal watchposts, road controls, and signal systems integrated into defensive networks. These features indicate an emphasis on early detection and communication rather than solely on fortification. In a landscape where rapid response could determine the outcome of disputes, the ability to gather and transmit information efficiently became a strategic advantage. This period also saw increased interaction between regional warrior groups. As disputes over land and succession multiplied, alliances shifted frequently. Maintaining awareness of rival intentions required continuous surveillance and local intermediaries. Records indicate that warriors relied on villagers, monks, and minor retainers to provide information, blurring the line between civilian and military participation in intelligence activities. This reliance reinforced the functional nature of espionage, embedding it within everyday governance. Importantly, these developments did not produce a distinct class equivalent to later conceptions of ninja. Intelligence roles remained embedded within broader military and administrative structures. However, the Kamakura period marked a critical stage in institutionalizing covert practices. Intelligence gathering was no longer an ad hoc response to crisis. It was a recognized requirement of effective rule. By the early 14th century, the limitations of this system became apparent. Communication delays, regional autonomy, and divided loyalties strained the shogunate's ability to maintain control. Yet the practices developed during this period endured. Samurai governance had normalized the use of scouts, informants, and covert tactics as integral components of warfare. This differentiation between open combat and concealed operations enabled regional specialization, particularly in areas where terrain and political conditions favored such methods. As Japan moved toward renewed fragmentation and civil conflict, these institutional precedents would be expanded and refined. The foundations laid during the Kamakura period shaped how intelligence was organized, valued, and deployed in the centuries that followed, setting the stage for the emergence of more specialized covert warfare traditions. Isolation became an advantage, not a weakness. Nestled in the mountainous interior of central Japan, the provinces of Iga and Kōga developed distinctive social and military structures precisely because central authority struggled to exert control. Geographic seclusion limited the reach of provincial governors and aristocratic landholders, creating conditions in which local communities could govern collectively. Over time, these communities, organized as leagues known as Iki, developed practices of intelligence gathering, ambush tactics, and counterintelligence that would later form the core of shinobi knowledge. Archaeological surveys in Iga and Kōga reveal patterns of settlement and fortification distinct from other provinces. Villages were dispersed across valleys, ridges, and forested slopes, often with concealed pathways linking them. Excavations of defensive works show simple, strategically placed barricades, watch posts, and restricted access routes optimized for small unit defense rather than open field engagement. These features reflect an adaptive approach to terrain, emphasizing surveillance, early warning, and rapid mobilization over massed confrontation. Documentary evidence supports the persistence of local autonomy. Tax records and land charters from the Kamakura and early Muromachi periods indicate that both Iga and Kōga retained substantial self-governance. Estate registers note that communities collected and administered local taxes independently, with minimal interference from distant lords. Temple archives confirm that local militias were mobilized for both defensive and offensive operations in disputes over land or resources. These sources illustrate that the society's independence was not temporary. It was institutionalized, allowing knowledge and practice to be transmitted across generations. The organizational model of these provinces was collective rather than hierarchical. Iki councils coordinated decisions regarding defense, resource allocation, and conflict resolution. Within these frameworks, certain individuals assumed responsibility for surveillance, reconnaissance, and tactical operations. While these roles were not formally hereditary or codified as a separate class, repeated practice over generations refined specialized skills. Scouts and informants gained intimate familiarity with local terrain, routes, and population movements, making them effective in both intelligence collection and early warning. Historical chronicles provide additional detail. The Bansonshuki, although compiled later in the 17th century, preserves accounts of techniques already in use in Iga and Kōga centuries earlier. While the text reflects retrospective codification, its descriptions correspond closely with patterns observed in settlement archaeology and local records. Activities included reconnaissance of neighboring territories, observation of political changes, infiltration during land disputes, and sabotage of hostile operations. These activities were pragmatic responses to structural conditions rather than ideological or ceremonial practices. Counterintelligence was also integral. Records note the monitoring of outsiders and visiting retainers, ensuring that information and tactical knowledge remained under local control. In effect, these communities maintained both offensive and defensive intelligence systems. This capacity to control information contributed to their enduring autonomy, allowing them to resist incorporation by neighboring feudal lords longer than other regions. By the late Kamakura period, Iga and Kōga had become recognized centers of practical military skill. Their independence fostered a self-reinforcing cycle. Isolated geography enabled autonomy, autonomy encouraged specialized tactics, and these tactics preserved independence. Unlike elsewhere in Japan, where military expertise was subsumed under samurai hierarchies, these regions preserved operational knowledge as part of communal responsibility, creating continuity in practice that would survive periods of broader political upheaval. Importantly, these developments did not yet constitute formal shinobi organizations as they would be understood in later centuries. There were no standing armies of covert operatives or codified schools. Nevertheless, the structural and environmental conditions created a sustained framework for training, experimentation, and knowledge transfer. These factors explain why Iga and Kōga became the repositories and incubators of techniques later associated with the shinobi. By the early 14th century, as the Kamakura shogunate weakened and regional warfare intensified, these autonomous systems provided a model for organized, adaptive covert operations. Communities of Iga and Kōga had refined methods of intelligence, ambush, and counter-surveillance that were robust, replicable, and suited to their unique environment. These systems matured further in response to the fragmentation and prolonged conflict that defined Japan's medieval centuries, setting the foundation for the professionalization of shinobi practice in subsequent eras. Names followed practice, not the other way around. The specialized roles associated with covert operations in medieval Japan existed well before the vocabulary to describe them was standardized. It was only in the 13th and 14th centuries that written references begin to identify such practitioners with terms like shinobi no mano or suppa. These terms illuminate how contemporaries perceived intelligence and clandestine activities, while also clarifying the anachronistic nature of modern labels, such as ninja. Documentary sources from this period, including estate records, military logs, and early war tales, employ a variety of descriptors for individuals performing reconnaissance, infiltration, or sabotage. The term shinobi no mano appears sporadically in provincial archives and is often contextualized as a functional label rather than a social identity. For instance, tax petitions or land dispute reports occasionally reference persons skilled in stealth or employed to gather information, indicating a role assigned according to need rather than a formalized profession. Another term, suppa or variants such as sapatsu, appears in correspondence and chronicles to denote agents capable of clandestine operations. Linguistic analysis demonstrates that these words were pragmatic descriptors, emphasizing the nature of tasks rather than an inherited title or hereditary office. In many cases, the same individuals could serve in multiple capacities: scouting, messenger duties, and occasional sabotage, depending on circumstance. The language reflects the fluidity and adaptability of these roles in the social and military structure of the period. Linguistic analysis also clarifies the origins of modern readings. The contemporary word ninja derives from the onyomi reading of the characters. Historical documents from the Kamakura and early Muromachi periods do not employ this pronunciation. It appears in later Edo period texts and popularized in modern scholarship and media. By examining primary sources in their historical context, it becomes clear that projecting the later term backward would misrepresent both the practice and its perception at the time. Textual cross-referencing strengthens these conclusions. Estate charters and temple records describe stealth-related tasks using phrases such as kakuramono, hidden person, or kajimono, shadow person. These designations are operational rather than honorific. Military chronicles similarly describe acts of reconnaissance and infiltration without naming individuals or emphasizing a collective identity. The functional orientation of the terminology aligns with the broader pattern observed in Iga and Kōga. Covert methods existed within existing social and military hierarchies, not as a separate class. Archaeological corroboration supports this linguistic perspective. Sites associated with Iga and Kōga settlements reveal strategic pathways, concealed posts, and compartmentalized defensive structures, demonstrating that practices requiring stealth and observation were widely distributed and integrated into daily life. The presence of these features aligns with documentary references to agents performing specialized tasks, confirming that terminology reflected pre-existing operational reality rather than creating it. By the 14th century, references to shinobi no mano and related descriptors became increasingly formalized in local records and chronicles of military campaigns. This formalization corresponds to the intensification of regional conflicts and the need for repeatable, reliable covert operations. Language thus mirrored the evolving role of these individuals. It tracked the professionalization and recognition of functions within a broader military and administrative context. Yet, even at this stage, the identity remained practical and situational, not institutionalized in the sense of rigid social hierarchy or hereditary office. Ultimately, the study of early terminology demonstrates that the historical foundation of shinobi practice rests in function and context rather than modern myth. Names emerged to describe tasks already in use. They codified observation, infiltration, and intelligence work, but did not invent them. As such, linguistic evidence provides a critical corrective to retrospective assumptions, allowing scholars to distinguish between documented historical practice and later narrative embellishment. By the mid-14th century, the vocabulary of covert operations had stabilized sufficiently to reflect common understanding across multiple regions, particularly in Iga, Kōga, and other mountainous provinces. This linguistic codification paralleled the practical maturation of intelligence practices. Language now documented the functional specialization that had been developing over centuries, laying the foundation for the more formalized shinobi roles that would emerge in the Sengoku period. Civil war transformed information into a decisive weapon. The collapse of the Kamakura shogunate and the emergence of rival northern and southern courts in 1336 plunged Japan into a prolonged period of political fragmentation and armed conflict. Conventional armies, constrained by terrain and logistics, were often insufficient to secure victory. As a result, commanders increasingly relied on reconnaissance, subterfuge, and disruption to gain an advantage over opponents. This period marks a significant expansion of covert functions within Japanese military operations, setting patterns that would influence subsequent centuries. The Nanbokucho Wars, as chronicled in texts such as the Taihiki, provide detailed accounts of both open battle and clandestine activity. Scouts and informants were deployed to observe enemy fortifications, troop movements, and supply lines. Reports describe night raids on garrisons, infiltration of rival territories, and targeted sabotage of infrastructure. These activities were conducted by locally recruited specialists embedded within larger military formations rather than by a formal, independent ninja class. Contemporary records emphasize practicality and immediate operational impact rather than the cultivation of a distinct social identity. Several examples illustrate the strategic use of covert operations. Mountain passes and river valleys were exploited to launch surprise assaults on lightly defended estates or supply convoys. Arson was frequently employed to disrupt logistics and create confusion, while misinformation campaigns, such as the dissemination of false troop movements, were used to manipulate enemy decision-making. These practices reflect an integrated approach in which intelligence, psychological pressure, and direct action were coordinated to achieve tactical advantage. They underscore the adaptive capacity of regional forces operating in challenging terrain. Textual sources reinforce the institutional embedding of these functions. Estate records and war chronicles note that local militias were often responsible for executing intelligence and sabotage operations under the guidance of samurai commanders. Individuals performing these tasks were selected for knowledge of terrain, stealth, and reliability rather than formal military rank. Their effectiveness relied on integration with the broader campaign strategy, demonstrating that covert tactics were operational tools rather than independent enterprises. Geography played a critical role in shaping these activities. The mountainous regions of central and western Japan, including the Iga and Kōga provinces, were ideal environments for small unit operations. Conventional armies found movement difficult, while local actors with intimate knowledge of paths, passes, and hidden routes could observe and strike with precision. Archaeological surveys of fortified settlements and transportation routes confirm the use of strategic concealment and compartmentalized access, consistent with textual descriptions of raids and reconnaissance. The landscape itself amplified the value of intelligence and irregular tactics. The scope of covert operations expanded beyond reconnaissance alone. Supply disruption, targeted arson, and psychological warfare became regular components of strategy. For example, disrupting granaries, blocking access to water, or creating misleading signals could destabilize enemy strongholds without direct confrontation. These methods demonstrate a growing sophistication in tactical thinking, where information management and terrain exploitation were integral to operational planning. Importantly, these roles remained embedded within broader military hierarchies, reflecting pragmatic rather than institutionalized specialization. Contemporary chronicles also note the challenges of allegiance and loyalty during this period. Rapidly shifting alliances and divided court support made accurate intelligence essential. Commanders increasingly relied on networks of local agents who could provide timely and reliable information about potential threats or opportunities. This reliance on human intelligence reinforced the expansion of shinobi functions, including surveillance, counter-surveillance, and clandestine communication. By the end of the mid-14th century, covert functions had become an established element of military practice in Japan. While still not formalized as a separate profession, these roles had expanded in scope, frequency, and strategic importance. The combination of civil war, fragmented authority, and challenging terrain created an environment in which intelligence and irregular operations were indispensable to survival and success. These developments set the stage for the next phase of specialization. As conflict intensified and territorial control remained contested, individuals and communities began to consolidate expertise in covert tactics. The functional knowledge accumulated during the Nanbo-Kucho Wars provided the operational and cultural foundation for the emergence of more structured shinobi networks in subsequent centuries, particularly in regions where geographic isolation preserved continuity and autonomy. Information moved faster than armies. During the mid-Nanbo-Kucho period, the fragmented political landscape demanded more than isolated acts of reconnaissance or sabotage. Commanders increasingly relied on networks of scouts, messengers, and infiltrators whose coordination spanned provincial boundaries. The mobility of intelligence operatives enabled rapid adaptation to shifting allegiances and fluctuating battlefronts, demonstrating that information could shape outcomes independently of conventional forces. Documentary evidence from land registers, temple archives, and local estate records indicates that these operatives were often hired temporarily, rather than retained as permanent staff. For instance, contracts note payments to agents for specific campaigns or assignments, highlighting a flexible system that could respond to immediate military needs. This fluidity prevented the emergence of rigid institutional hierarchies while simultaneously facilitating the circulation of tactical knowledge across regions. Skills learned in one domain were applied in another, reinforcing operational continuity without formal codification. Chronicles such as the Taihiki describe episodes in which intelligence from multiple districts was integrated into campaign planning. Scouts from Iga or Kōga provinces were dispatched to observe enemy positions, while messengers relayed information to distant commanders. Infiltrators carried out targeted operations to disrupt supply lines or gather sensitive intelligence. The coordination of these roles demonstrates the emergence of functional networks rather than isolated practitioners, creating a proto-intelligence system embedded within the broader military framework. archaeological studies corroborate this operational model. Mountain passes, hidden trails, and interlinked villages in central Japan show evidence of routes optimized for rapid movement and discreet communication. Sites in Iga and Kōga include observation posts with line of sight to neighboring valleys, signaling stations, and concealed entry points, indicating that the physical environment was leveraged to facilitate networked operations. These findings align with documentary accounts, confirming the integration of geography and human intelligence in early covert coordination. Temple documents further highlight the administrative dimension of these networks. Religious institutions were frequently intermediaries, providing shelter, communication channels, or logistical support for operatives. Such involvement allowed information to traverse multiple jurisdictions while maintaining discretion. It also reflects the blurred boundary between civilian and military spheres in intelligence activities. Communities participated in the system without forming a formalized or hereditary class. The mid-14th century also saw the increasing standardization of practices within these networks. While formal institutions remained absent, consistent methods of reconnaissance, signaling, and infiltration appear across multiple regions. Agents developed a shared understanding of timing, concealment, and reporting procedures, demonstrating that operational norms could emerge organically. These proto-standardized practices laid the foundation for the procedural knowledge that would characterize later shinobi communities. Importantly, the evidence challenges modern perceptions of the lone ninja. Historical sources reveal that covert operations were collective, systematized, and relational. Success depended on coordination between multiple actors performing specialized but complementary functions. Intelligence was generated, transmitted, and applied as part of a network, rather than by individuals acting in isolation. This systemic perspective clarifies the historical reality of early shinobi practice: functional, integrated, and strategic. By the close of the Nanbokucho period, these networks had become robust enough to support sustained campaigns across multiple provinces. Their effectiveness relied on speed, discretion, and adaptability, allowing commanders to exploit terrain, human resources, and local knowledge in a coordinated manner. Intelligence mobility created a strategic advantage that complemented conventional military power, demonstrating that information infrastructure could rival, and in some cases surpass, the impact of armies in determining outcomes. These developments mark a crucial evolutionary step in covert warfare. Temporary operatives, fluid assignments, and coordinated multi-role networks illustrate a sophisticated understanding of intelligence as a systemic function. As warfare became endemic in the following centuries, these structures matured further, forming the operational backbone for more formalized shinobi communities, particularly in regions such as Iga and Kōga where geographic isolation preserved continuity and operational expertise. By war's end, secrecy was no longer exceptional. During the latter part of the Nanbokucho period, sustained civil conflict normalized covert operations within military strategy. Though explicit terminology such as shinobi remained sporadic, samurai commanders increasingly incorporated stealth, reconnaissance, and sabotage into formal planning. The accumulation of experience across decades of fragmented warfare transformed these previously ad hoc practices into recognized military functions, providing the procedural groundwork for the systematic employment of operatives in the Sengoku era. Military chronicles, estate records, and provincial documents from the late 14th century reveal repeated instances of covert assignments integrated with conventional campaigns. Commanders organized detachments specifically for reconnaissance, supply disruption, and the monitoring of rival movements. These operatives were often locally recruited, selected for knowledge of terrain, observation skills, and discretion. Their inclusion in strategic planning indicates that intelligence was no longer incidental but valued as a force multiplier capable of influencing campaign outcomes. The transition from improvised tactics to recognized functions is evident in how operations were documented and coordinated. Land registers and war tales describe assignments with defined objectives, timelines, and reporting expectations. For example, scouts were tasked with observing enemy positions along mountain passes, infiltrators disrupted access routes, and messengers ensured communication between dispersed units. While these roles did not constitute a formal class or hereditary office, their repeated integration into campaign strategy represents a shift toward institutional recognition. Geography again played a critical role. Mountainous provinces such as Iga and Kōga provided natural laboratories for refining covert tactics. Familiarity with concealed paths, observation points, and local settlements allowed operatives to gather information efficiently and execute targeted disruption. Archaeological surveys confirm the presence of networked routes, fortified hilltops, and concealed approaches, demonstrating the integration of terrain knowledge into operational planning. This localized expertise enhanced the effectiveness of coordinated operations in broader campaigns. Documentation also suggests increasing attention to procedural security and counterintelligence. Commanders instructed operatives to monitor rival movements, verify reports from multiple sources, and maintain secrecy regarding assignments. Temple and estate records note temporary deployment of agents across districts, ensuring that sensitive information was shared selectively and acted upon promptly. This system of distributed, task-specific operatives mirrors early intelligence networks, reinforcing the notion of covert work as a functional, organized component of warfare. Contemporary narratives reinforce these findings. The Taihiki and other war chronicles provide repeated examples of stealth, diversion, and surprise integrated into campaign planning. Episodes describe coordinated night attacks on garrisons, infiltration of contested villages, and sabotage of critical infrastructure. In each case, covert actions were contextualized as deliberate tactical measures, highlighting that secrecy had become an accepted instrument of military practice rather than a marginal or exceptional strategy. This institutional acknowledgement extended to command decision-making. Samurai leaders increasingly recognized the strategic value of intelligence and covert disruption in planning engagements, selecting operatives with specific skills and deploying them according to operational requirements. While these practitioners were not formally codified as a social class, their functional significance within campaign structures reflects an emergent professionalization of role and method. By the end of the 14th century, the cumulative effect of decades of civil warfare was clear. Intelligence, reconnaissance, and covert action were understood as essential to campaign success. The practical knowledge accumulated in Iga, Kōga, and other mountainous regions provided reliable methods for gathering information, conducting sabotage, and influencing enemy behavior. These practices, once improvised, were now recognized as repeatable functions integral to strategic planning. These developments set a precedent for the military culture of the Sengoku period. Commanders in the 15th and 16th centuries inherited a body of operational knowledge emphasizing intelligence, terrain exploitation, and tactical deception. The functional roles established during the Nanbo-Kacho Wars would be systematized further, evolving into the professionalized, regionally specialized shinobi networks historically associated with Iga and Kōga. In effect, the recognition of covert roles in late 14th century campaigns provided the structural and cultural foundation for one of the most distinctive aspects of Japanese military history. By the close of the Nanbo-Kacho era, covert operations had transitioned from sporadic expedients to acknowledged instruments of war. Though still embedded within broader military hierarchies and rarely named explicitly, these functions demonstrated that secrecy, intelligence, and tactical subtlety were now indispensable components of warfare. This maturation marked a critical step toward the systematization of shinobi practice, situating espionage and subterfuge firmly within the operational framework of samurai campaigns. Victory increasingly depended on what could not be seen. The outbreak of the Unin War in 1467 and the ensuing Sengoku period intensified competition among regional daimyō, creating an environment in which conventional military power alone was insufficient for success. Fortified castles, shifting alliances, and contested territories made intelligence and covert operations indispensable. Daimyō relied on networks of operatives to gather information, infiltrate enemy positions, and counter rival espionage, marking a turning point in the systematization of shinobi functions. Military correspondence from the late 15th century, including letters and estate reports, provides evidence of organized intelligence activity. Commanders documented the use of scouts to monitor enemy troop movements, infiltration teams to survey fortifications, and agents responsible for spreading disinformation. These records indicate that daimyō treated intelligence as a formal component of campaign planning, reflecting the recognition of covert operations as a strategic asset rather than a sporadic expedient. Several interpretive insights emerge from these sources. First, intelligence became integrated with broader operational objectives. Observations of enemy strength and positioning informed both tactical engagement and resource allocation. Second, the functional specialization of operatives increased. Individuals were selected based on terrain knowledge, stealth, or local contacts, demonstrating an early division of labor within intelligence networks. These roles were often temporary assignments but were systematically coordinated to maximize effectiveness. Archaeological evidence complements documentary records. Surveys of mountain fortresses and castle complexes reveal hidden approaches, concealed observation posts, and restricted access routes designed for covert entry and reconnaissance. These structural adaptations indicate that daimyō actively incorporated the operational requirements of intelligence gathering into architectural planning, highlighting the strategic importance of shinobi functions in a period of continuous conflict. Training and recruitment also became increasingly formalized. Later military manuals, such as the Bansenshuki, describe methods for developing stealth, surveillance, and infiltration skills, drawing on techniques established in Iga and Kōga. While these manuals were compiled in the early Edo period, their content reflects practices already operational in the late 15th century. The repeated reference to specific exercises and principles suggests continuity and systematization, confirming that covert operations were treated as skill-based and replicable disciplines rather than improvised tasks. Counterintelligence was an equally critical component. Daimyō implemented measures to detect and neutralize infiltrators and informants from rival domains. Temple records and estate petitions document the interception of messages, monitoring of suspicious travelers, and verification of intelligence reports. These procedures demonstrate that operational security was recognized as integral to maintaining strategic advantage, further embedding covert roles within military planning. By the end of the 15th century, daimyō had institutionalized these practices to the extent that intelligence networks were considered essential components of military infrastructure. Temporary assignments of scouts and infiltrators were systematically organized, with clearly defined objectives and reporting protocols. The incorporation of these roles into campaign strategy reflects the maturation of covert operations from ad hoc expedients to recognized, professionalized military functions. This period marks a crucial juncture in the evolution of shinobi. Practical necessity drove specialization, reinforced by local expertise and collective experience. Operatives were integrated into hierarchical structures, coordinated across multiple roles, and deployed in accordance with strategic planning. Though formal social recognition of shinobi remained limited, their functions were now codified in practice, laying the foundation for the highly organized and regionally concentrated networks of the early Sengoku period. The recognition of intelligence as a strategic tool had enduring consequences for Japanese military culture. Commanders who mastered reconnaissance, infiltration, and counterintelligence gained decisive advantages, enabling smaller forces to influence outcomes disproportionately. By emphasizing information and stealth alongside conventional force, daimyō established operational norms that would persist and expand in subsequent decades, shaping both the conduct of war and the institutional evolution of shinobi networks. By the turn of the 16th century, victory was inseparable from knowledge and secrecy. The late 15th century set the precedent. Covert operations were no longer optional or exceptional, they were fundamental. This institutionalization of intelligence roles initiated the transition from localized, loosely organized operatives to the professionalized shinobi structures that would dominate the Sengoku landscape. Neutrality became a marketable skill. During the early Sengoku period, the mountainous regions of Iga and Kōga produced operatives whose specialized knowledge of terrain, infiltration, and intelligence was in demand across Japan. Unlike conventional samurai retainers, these individuals were often hired temporarily by daimyō for specific campaigns or strategic objectives. Their semi-autonomous status allowed them to maintain operational independence while disseminating techniques beyond their home provinces. Documentary evidence and oral traditions indicate that Iga and Kōga operatives were contracted for reconnaissance, castle infiltration, and targeted disruption of enemy logistics. Estate records and war correspondence detail payments for short-term service, emphasizing performance and results rather than loyalty or feudal obligation. This flexible employment model reinforced the continuity of covert practices within their home communities, preserving expertise while enabling the transfer of skills across regions. The operational effectiveness of Iga and Kōga specialists rested on their intimate knowledge of local geography and community networks. Archaeological surveys of these provinces reveal concealed trails, hidden passes, and fortified village structures that facilitated movement, observation, and communication. Operatives trained from a young age to exploit these environments, developing expertise in stealth, ambush, and surveillance. Their proficiency allowed them to navigate complex terrain faster than conventional forces, providing a strategic advantage to daimyō who employed them. Several interpretive insights emerge from this period. First, the semi-autonomous employment model demonstrates that shinobi functions were valued as skills rather than status. Their neutrality allowed them to serve multiple patrons without permanent allegiance, making operational proficiency the key currency of their social and economic capital. Second, the circulation of Iga and Kōga operatives enabled tacit knowledge transfer. Techniques and practices honed in isolated provinces spread organically, contributing to the early standardization of covert operations. Contemporary chronicles, such as campaign diaries and Gunki Monogatari, describe coordinated operations in which Iga and Kōga agents undertook reconnaissance, sabotage, and intelligence collection. These accounts often emphasize integration with samurai forces while maintaining operational discretion. Agents operated in small, disciplined teams, executing assignments according to predefined objectives, reflecting early procedural standardization of covert tactics. Military correspondence from daimyō headquarters further confirms the strategic deployment of these operatives. Messages specify target locations, objectives, and timing, demonstrating that employment was professional, conditional, and performance-oriented. Documentation also notes that operatives occasionally returned to their home provinces between assignments, underscoring their semi-independent status and the fluidity of service. Unlike hereditary retainers bound to a single lord, these specialists operated as highly skilled contractors whose allegiance was contingent on task and remuneration. The integration of Iga and Kōga operatives contributed to a gradual systematization of techniques. Practices such as infiltration of fortifications, observation of enemy movements, and psychological disruption became repeatable and codified through communal teaching within the provinces. Oral traditions and early manuals hint at exercises in stealth, concealment, and signaling, indicating the emergence of methodological training. These methods allowed operatives to function effectively across different terrains and operational contexts, reinforcing the value of standardized procedures. Counterintelligence practices also matured during this period. Operatives monitored enemy infiltrators, verified intelligence from multiple sources, and maintained secrecy regarding assignments. Temple archives and local estate petitions confirm that operational security was integral to campaigns, with failures documented and adjustments made accordingly. These measures reflect an understanding of espionage as a disciplined, systematized function rather than sporadic or improvisational activity. By the mid-16th century, the professional employment of Iga and Kōga operatives had established a model for semi-autonomous intelligence networks. Their neutrality, mobility, and specialized skill set enabled a form of knowledge circulation that preserved traditional techniques while promoting procedural consistency. The effectiveness of these operatives contributed directly to military outcomes and reinforced the perception that intelligence, infiltration, and disruption were essential strategic tools. These developments set the stage for fully integrated shinobi networks in later Sengoku campaigns. The combination of semi-autonomous employment, standardized techniques, and geographic expertise provided both operational continuity and adaptability. Iga and Kōga operatives had transitioned from locally trained specialists to recognized strategic assets, demonstrating the growing institutional importance of covert roles in Japanese military culture. By reinforcing the value of skill, adaptability, and discretion. The early Sengoku period crystallized the professional and tactical identity of shinobi. Operational techniques were now codified within communities, applied strategically across Japan, and acknowledged as indispensable to daimyō objectives. The semi-autonomous, contract-based model of service ensured that these practices remained robust, transferable, and resilient, laying the foundation for the systematized intelligence structures that would dominate the later Sengoku century. Not every battle was decided by force. During the mid-Sengoku period, daimyō recognized that intelligence, sabotage, and deception could be as decisive as armed confrontation. Iga and Kōga operatives were employed to gather battlefield intelligence, disrupt enemy logistics, spread false information, and, in some documented cases, carry out targeted assassinations. These activities were tactical instruments rather than folkloric spectacle, reflecting strategic adaptation to protracted and complex warfare. Contemporary chronicles and campaign diaries, including Provincial Gunki Monogatari, provide detailed accounts of reconnaissance missions preceding sieges and open engagements. Scouts monitored enemy troop movements, mapped terrain features, and reported vulnerabilities in fortifications. Observations were often transmitted via messengers along hidden routes, enabling commanders to adjust strategies with real-time information. Archaeological surveys of castles and mountain passes corroborate these accounts, revealing concealed trails and observation points designed specifically for stealth operations. In addition to surveillance, operatives executed sabotage to undermine opposing forces. Granaries, bridges, and supply lines were targeted to slow enemy movement or reduce morale. Estate records and temple documents note temporary deployment of Iga and Kōga specialists to disrupt logistics during campaigns in western Japan. While the scale of these operations was relatively limited, the strategic impact was significant, demonstrating that small, well-coordinated teams could influence outcomes disproportionately to their size. False signaling and psychological operations also emerged as formalized practices. Campaign reports describe tactics such as feigned troop movements, misleading banners, and nighttime diversions designed to confuse enemy commanders. These techniques relied on intimate knowledge of terrain and timing, as well as coordination with conventional forces, reinforcing the systemic nature of covert operations. The procedural consistency of such methods indicates that they were repeatable and taught within operative communities. Assassination and targeted elimination of key figures are documented in a few instances, though later sources often exaggerate their frequency and dramatic effect. Primary records indicate that such operations were employed sparingly and pragmatically, generally to remove commanders or disrupt leadership during sieges or political crises. The careful selection of targets and the tactical integration of these missions reflect a professionalized, task-specific approach rather than sensationalized legend. Military correspondence further supports this understanding. Daimyō instructions specified objectives, operational boundaries, and reporting mechanisms for deployed operatives. Records note that missions were time-limited and integrated with larger strategic plans, reflecting professional accountability. Operatives were selected based on experience, local knowledge, and skill set, ensuring that their activities aligned with overall campaign priorities. The emphasis on objective-oriented performance indicates that covert operations had become a recognized, functional component of military practice. Geography continued to shape tactical options. Mountain passes, river valleys, and forested ridges were exploited for observation, ambush, and communication. Surveyed remains of hidden trails and lookout positions correspond closely with recorded assignments, confirming the practical deployment of specialized skills. The physical environment both constrained and enabled operational innovation, making local expertise an indispensable asset for daimyō seeking competitive advantage. By the late 16th century, battlefield and extramural roles of shinobi had achieved a high degree of operational codification. Reconnaissance, sabotage, signaling deception, and selective disruption were routinely integrated into campaign planning. While folklore would later exaggerate certain feats, historical evidence confirms that these functions were tactical tools, systematically applied to achieve strategic objectives. Procedural consistency, integration with conventional forces, and reliance on local knowledge established a professional framework for covert operations. The successful application of these practices encouraged further codification. Observed effectiveness in battles and sieges led commanders to incorporate these roles into planning, assign specialized tasks, and communicate procedures clearly. These developments marked the transition from loosely organized, temporary engagements to structured operational doctrine. Covert action was no longer ancillary. It was recognized as an essential component of military strategy. By distinguishing documented practice from legend, this period demonstrates that shinobi activity was defined by utility, coordination, and expertise. Operational success depended on careful planning, skillful execution, and integration with conventional forces, setting the precedent for the professionalized, systematized networks of the late Sengoku period. In effect, the battlefield and its surrounding logistical and political spaces became laboratories for refining covert tactics, laying the foundation for the mature operational structures that would dominate Japanese warfare in the late 16th century. Doctrine preserved practice after practice declined. By the late Sengoku and early Edo periods, centuries of operational experience among Iga and Kōga specialists had accumulated into a corpus of knowledge. Texts such as the Shininki, compiled c. 1681, and the Bansenshuki, compiled 1676, codified stealth, intelligence gathering, infiltration, and operational strategy, translating lived practice into written doctrine. These manuals preserved methods that had already been tested, systematized, and adapted during decades of conflict. The historical context of these compilations is critical. By the mid-17th century, the Tokugawa shogunate had consolidated authority, reducing the prevalence of large-scale warfare. The decline in active military engagements created a need to record and transmit specialized skills before they were lost. Consequently, these texts functioned as reflective guides rather than contemporary training manuals. They offer insight into operational procedures, organizational methods, and practical wisdom developed over centuries of semi-autonomous service, particularly in Iga and Kōga. The manuals exhibit systematic categorization of operational roles. Sections delineate scouting techniques, infiltration strategies, methods of concealment, and counterintelligence. Emphasis is placed on preparation, observation, and adaptation to environment and circumstance. Illustrative examples include the use of hidden trails, signaling techniques, and procedures for entering fortified structures. The texts prioritize replicable methodology, demonstrating that the goal was to codify knowledge for continuity rather than narrative embellishment. The Shininki emphasizes psychological and observational training, instructing operatives on subtlety in movement, situational awareness, and understanding human behavior. Similarly, the Bansenshuki extends doctrinal coverage to organizational structure, including the deployment of teams, communication protocols, and integration with conventional forces. Together, these works illustrate a comprehensive approach to covert operations, combining practical skill with strategic thinking. Archaeological and architectural evidence aligns with textual descriptions. Hidden routes, observation posts, and compartmentalized dwellings in Iga and Kōga correspond to manualized techniques of movement and concealment. Tools, climbing devices, and signaling implements mentioned in the texts have been recovered at historical sites, confirming the material culture described in the manuals. These correlations demonstrate that the doctrine reflects operational reality rather than theoretical speculation. Historical commentary indicates that these manuals were intended for practitioners with prior field experience. Instructions are detailed but assume familiarity with terrain, timing, and basic tactics. This implies a system in which knowledge was transmitted orally and experientially before codification. Written doctrine supplemented, rather than replaced, apprenticeship and communal training, preserving the essence of semi-autonomous operational networks while enabling broader dissemination. The reflective nature of these texts also underscores the evolution of shinobi practice. They document techniques that had proven effective under the decentralized, high-intensity warfare of the Sengoku period, capturing lessons learned across multiple generations. Their preservation ensured that the operational knowledge of Iga and Kōga could survive political stabilization and reduce demand for covert action, transitioning from immediate battlefield utility to structured institutional memory. By the early Edo period, manuals functioned as repositories of both technical and strategic knowledge. They preserved methods of intelligence, infiltration, and sabotage while offering guidance on organizational and ethical considerations. Their compilation demonstrates recognition of the importance of formalized doctrine in maintaining operational proficiency, even in periods of relative peace. The enduring influence of these texts illustrates the centrality of written knowledge in sustaining the legacy of shinobi practice. In conclusion, shinobi manuals reflect the codification of centuries of experiential knowledge. They document procedures, strategies, and operational frameworks developed during the Sengoku period and earlier, preserving skills that might have otherwise disappeared in the transition to Tokugawa peace. By recording both practical techniques and organizational principles, these texts ensured continuity, transforming lived practice into structured doctrine and securing the operational heritage of Iga and Kōga operatives for future generations. Versatility defined effectiveness. The operational demands placed on Iga and Kōga operatives required comprehensive preparation across physical, cognitive, and environmental domains. Training extended beyond martial skill, encompassing endurance, survival, literacy, and situational awareness. Mastery of these competencies enabled operatives to function independently, adapt to diverse terrains, and fulfill multiple roles within military campaigns. Physical conditioning was foundational. Historical accounts and oral traditions describe exercises designed to enhance agility, balance, and stamina. Traversing mountainous terrain, scaling walls, and moving undetected over long distances necessitated a high level of fitness. Archival references suggest that young trainees engaged in routine long-distance marches, climbing drills, and load-bearing exercises, developing the strength and dexterity essential for infiltration and reconnaissance operations. Survival and environmental skills formed another pillar of training. Operatives learned to identify edible plants, navigate using natural landmarks, and conceal themselves in forested and mountainous terrain. They practiced building temporary shelters, tracking both humans and animals, and utilizing local resources for sustenance. These abilities ensured operational autonomy and reduced dependence on supply lines, reinforcing the strategic advantage of highly mobile teams. Cognitive and informational skills were equally emphasized. Literacy and numeracy enabled operatives to read maps, interpret documents, and communicate intelligence effectively. Understanding local politics, social networks, and enemy routines contributed to informed decision-making in the field. Manuals such as the Bansenshuki and Shininki reference mnemonic techniques, observation protocols, and methods for interpreting human behavior, illustrating the integration of analytical training alongside physical and survival competencies. Situational awareness and adaptive problem-solving were cultivated through controlled exercises and scenario-based drills. Trainees were taught to observe enemy movements, anticipate reactions, and exploit vulnerabilities. They practiced evasion, stealth movement, and silent communication to synchronize with team members during operations. Historical narratives suggest that these skills were reinforced by field exercises in environments simulating realistic operational conditions, including mountainous passes, river valleys, and village clusters. The transmission of knowledge combined oral instruction, apprenticeship, and supervised field experience. Senior operatives guided trainees through exercises, demonstrating techniques while correcting errors in real time. Communal drills and scenario exercises reinforced teamwork and procedural consistency. This experiential learning ensured that tacit knowledge, such as recognizing natural cover or interpreting enemy behavior, was retained across generations even before formal manuals were widely disseminated. Historical records also highlight the role of discipline and incremental skill development. Training progressed from basic endurance and observation exercises to advanced infiltration, sabotage, and intelligence-gathering techniques. Structured progression allowed operatives to acquire foundational skills before attempting complex, high-risk missions, minimizing operational failure and preserving both human and strategic capital. The interplay between skill acquisition and technological adaptation was significant. Training incorporated the use of tools and equipment, including grappling implements, concealment devices, and signaling materials, which augmented physical and cognitive capabilities. Trainees practiced integrating equipment with natural terrain, demonstrating procedural competence in tool-assisted infiltration and observation. By the late Sengoku period, these comprehensive regimens produced operatives capable of independent action and coordinated team operations. Physical resilience, environmental literacy, analytical acumen, and procedural skill coalesced into an integrated operational profile. Versatility, rather than specialization in a single combat or espionage technique, defined operational effectiveness, ensuring that Iga and Kōga operatives could meet the diverse challenges of intelligence work across Japan. These training practices laid the foundation for the systematic codification of operational knowledge in manuals and communal instruction. The combination of physical, cognitive, and environmental preparation reinforced the strategic utility of shinobi networks and ensured the continuity of effective practice across generations. The next logical step in operational development involved specialized equipment, enabling trainees to apply these skills with enhanced capability and precision. Utility, not mystique, guided design. The operational equipment of Iga and Kōga operatives was tailored for effectiveness in reconnaissance, infiltration, and sabotage. Historical records, material culture, and archaeological evidence allow us to distinguish documented tools from later fictionalized portrayals, emphasizing practical functionality over legend. Archaeological surveys in the Iga and Kōga regions reveal implements consistent with covert operational requirements. Small blades, climbing aids, grappling hooks, and portable ladders were recovered in sites corresponding to late Sengoku fortifications and village settlements. These tools facilitated silent entry, scaling walls, and traversal of rugged terrain, confirming that equipment design prioritized mobility, concealment, and durability. Textual sources reinforce these findings. Manuals such as the Bansenshuki describe grappling implements, climbing spikes, and concealed knives, often in conjunction with environmental adaptation techniques. Instructions emphasize using these tools efficiently, integrating them with natural cover, and maintaining operational secrecy. The consistency between material evidence and textual prescriptions underscores the practical orientation of shinobi equipment. Conversely, popular culture often attributes to shinobi an arsenal of exotic or implausible devices. Chains, exploding powders, or specialized throwing weapons appear in Edo period fiction and modern media, but lack corroborating evidence from contemporary records or excavated sites. Historians distinguish these items from documented implements, recognizing that imaginative embellishment gradually overlaid factual operational practice in storytelling traditions. Field reports and estate records provide additional context. Payments for tool production, storage, and repair indicate sustained operational use of functional equipment. Small, lightweight, and easily transportable implements were prioritized, allowing operatives to maintain mobility over extended campaigns. Records also note occasional customization to suit local terrain, reflecting adaptability and iterative design informed by practical experience. Archaeological observations further illustrate the integration of tools with environmental knowledge. Hidden paths, observation posts, and concealed entryways in mountainous regions align with the use of climbing aids, ladders, and ropes, demonstrating coordinated exploitation of both human and natural resources. The synergy between tools and terrain amplified operational effectiveness and reduced the risk of detection, reflecting a systematized approach to equipment utilization. Material culture was complemented by procedural discipline. Manuals describe protocols for the discrete storage, maintenance, and transport of implements, emphasizing that readiness and concealment were as critical as the tool itself. Training and apprenticeship included instruction in tool use and care, ensuring that equipment supported mission objectives reliably. These practices reinforced the operational principle that practical functionality superseded spectacle or complexity. Counterintelligence considerations also influenced equipment design. Tools were lightweight, easily concealed, and minimally traceable, reducing the risk of compromise if an operative was intercepted. These constraints guided technological choices, illustrating a deliberate balance between capability and operational security. Equipment selection was therefore an extension of procedural doctrine, integrating technical design with tactical methodology. By the end of the Sengoku period, the documented suite of shinobi implements included climbing aids, portable ladders, concealment knives, signaling devices, and basic sabotage tools. These items, corroborated by both archaeological recovery and textual instruction, exemplify a material culture driven by utility, adaptability, and integration with human and environmental knowledge. They served as extensions of the operative's training, enabling skillful execution of reconnaissance, infiltration, and disruption. The operational logic underlying these tools provided the foundation for subsequent innovations in stealth, disguise, and covert mobility. Practical design principles, lightweight, functional, and terrain-adapted, would continue to shape shinobi material culture into the early Edo period. These principles extended naturally into techniques of concealment and disguise, where the same emphasis on operational efficiency governed both physical implements and behavioral adaptation. In conclusion, the historical evidence confirms that shinobi equipment was designed for functionality. Archaeology and textual sources jointly verify that tools were task-oriented, standardized in use, and integrated with training and operational procedures. Separating documented implements from legend clarifies the practical realities of covert operations, reinforcing that utility, rather than mystique, defined shinobi material culture and underpinned the success of their specialized tasks. Walls delayed armies, not information. During the protracted conflicts of the Sengoku period, fortified castles presented formidable obstacles to conventional military forces. Yet Iga and Kōga operatives routinely penetrated these defenses, not to seize fortifications outright, but to gather actionable intelligence that shaped the outcomes of campaigns. These documented operations reveal the sophisticated integration of stealth, reconnaissance, and strategic planning in Japanese warfare. Contemporary chronicles, including Gunki Monogatari and campaign reports, record multiple instances of infiltration during sieges. Operatives were assigned to observe troop movements, map internal layouts, monitor supply stockpiles, and identify leadership positions within castles. The primary goal was not immediate assault but informed decision-making, enabling daimyō to adjust strategies and allocate resources efficiently. In many cases, intelligence acquired by a handful of operatives determined whether an army engaged directly, besieged, or retreated. Archaeological surveys of Sengoku period castles corroborate textual accounts. Hidden staircases, concealed corridors, and narrow service passages suggest pre-existing points of access that could be exploited by skilled infiltrators. Trenches, walls, and gatehouses, while designed to impede large forces, offered small operatives opportunities for entry, observation, and egress. The alignment of material evidence with documented operations demonstrates that infiltration techniques were grounded in the practical exploitation of structural vulnerabilities. Operational methodology was highly procedural. Infiltration missions typically involved detailed planning, including reconnaissance of surrounding terrain, timing of enemy patrols, and coordination with external units. Messages, notes, or visual signals were transmitted to commanders outside the castle, allowing information to influence tactical decisions in near real time. This procedural rigor indicates that castle infiltration was an organized function within military campaigns rather than isolated acts of audacity. Some missions extended beyond reconnaissance into minor sabotage. Chronicles detail instances where operatives disrupted supplies, damaged gates, or created diversions to facilitate larger assaults. These actions were carefully limited to maintain plausible deniability and avoid premature engagement. In effect, the boundary between intelligence gathering and tactical disruption was fluid, with missions tailored to the strategic needs of the employing daimyō. Command correspondence further illuminates operational structure. Assignments often included explicit objectives, reporting schedules, and contingency procedures. Operatives were selected based on prior experience, physical aptitude, and knowledge of the specific castle or surrounding area. Instructions emphasize discretion, rapid movement, and accurate observation, highlighting that success relied on procedural discipline rather than improvisation. The formalization of these tasks reflects a mature understanding of covert operations within military hierarchies. Environmental adaptation was critical. Operatives leveraged natural cover, weather conditions, and topographic features to avoid detection. Stealth was augmented by timing activities during low visibility periods, such as nighttime or fog, and by using local knowledge to exploit unguarded paths. Archaeological traces of concealed trails and service corridors reinforce textual evidence, confirming that infiltration tactics integrated skill, terrain, and environmental awareness. Historical records also indicate that infiltration contributed to psychological effects on defenders. Awareness of potential covert observation or sabotage created tension, uncertainty, and distraction, which could weaken morale and prompt preemptive defensive errors. While such outcomes were secondary to intelligence acquisition, they illustrate the multifaceted strategic impact of small, mobile teams operating within fortified sites. By the end of the Sengoku period, documented castle infiltrations had become a standard component of operational planning. Intelligence from within fortifications informed strategic decisions, guided troop deployment, and facilitated negotiations or assaults. Procedural consistency, environmental adaptation, and integration with broader military objectives ensured that these missions were both effective and replicable. In conclusion, castle infiltration during the Sengoku period demonstrates the systematic application of stealth, reconnaissance, and tactical planning in Japanese warfare. Walls could impede armies, but information moved independently, transmitted by skilled operatives who combined environmental knowledge, procedural discipline, and operational training. These documented operations laid the foundation for later, more formalized methods of intelligence and sabotage, highlighting the central role of shinobi in shaping both the conduct and outcomes of Sengoku military campaigns. Some missions escalated into sabotage, extending operational scope from observation to disruption and targeted tactical intervention, marking the next evolution in shinobi employment. Fear multiplied physical damage. During the tumultuous Sengoku period, Iga and Kōga operatives undertook missions extending beyond reconnaissance into sabotage, arson, and psychological disruption. While physical effects could be limited, the perception of vulnerability often amplified the strategic impact, shaping campaign outcomes in ways that conventional force alone could not achieve. Contemporary chronicles, estate records, and campaign diaries document a range of sabotage activities. Operatives were tasked with burning supply depots, cutting communication lines, or obstructing roads to impede enemy troop movements. Arson frequently targeted granaries or temporary fortifications during sieges, creating logistical strain and compelling defenders to divert resources to protection and repair. The effectiveness of these interventions was magnified when executed under the cover of darkness, allowing minimal exposure while maximizing operational impact. Psychological operations were closely integrated with sabotage. Reports indicate that the presence or rumored activity of stealth operatives induced anxiety, eroded morale, and prompted defensive miscalculations. Even when physical damage was minor, the belief that unseen enemies could infiltrate strongholds heightened stress among defenders. Chroniclers note that the fear of infiltration could force premature retreats, overextension of forces, or heightened vigilance that reduced efficiency, illustrating that the operational effect of sabotage extended beyond material destruction. Operational methodology emphasized preparation, timing, and coordination. Missions were planned with specific objectives, including target selection, method of disruption, and exfiltration routes. Communication with commanding units ensured that sabotage complemented ongoing operations, whether supporting a siege, diverting enemy attention, or facilitating broader strategic maneuvers. Field manuals and oral traditions indicate that operatives were trained in multiple sabotage techniques, including fire setting, obstruction of transport, and diversionary signaling, allowing them to select methods appropriate to terrain, opportunity, and strategic need. Archaeological evidence corroborates textual accounts. Remains of burned storage structures, disrupted roads, and temporary fortifications in regions of known Iga and Kōga activity correspond with recorded campaigns. These findings demonstrate that sabotage missions left tangible traces consistent with operational accounts, reinforcing the reality of their practical implementation. Historical correspondence also emphasizes operational discretion. Executives of covert missions were instructed to minimize exposure, preserve tools, and avoid unnecessary engagement with enemy forces. Risk management was integral. Operatives balanced potential tactical gains against the likelihood of capture or compromise. Successful execution required mastery of movement, timing, and observation skills developed through structured training in physical conditioning, environmental adaptation, and procedural discipline. Despite careful planning, not all sabotage missions succeeded. Records indicate that patrols, environmental obstacles, and fortuitous defensive measures sometimes neutralized operative efforts. Failures were analyzed within communities of practice, contributing to iterative improvement of techniques and procedural doctrine. These experiences reinforced the importance of skill, preparation, and adaptability in covert operations, establishing a feedback loop that shaped the evolution of shinobi methods. The combination of physical, logistical, and psychological effects illustrates the multidimensional impact of sabotage. Targeting supplies, infrastructure, and morale simultaneously allowed operatives to influence enemy decision-making, slow troop movements, and create strategic openings. Integration with conventional military campaigns amplified effectiveness. A well-timed disruption could allow an allied force to seize the initiative, exploit weakened defenses, or negotiate from a position of advantage. By the late Sengoku period, documented operations demonstrate that sabotage and psychological manipulation were essential components of military strategy. Physical damage alone was insufficient. Operational success depended on perception, timing, and coordination. Historical records consistently emphasize that the mere threat of infiltration could achieve strategic effects comparable to overt attacks, highlighting the value of fear as a force multiplier in covert operations. In conclusion, sabotage, arson, and psychological disruption exemplify the strategic sophistication of Iga and Kōga operatives. Their missions combined targeted physical intervention with manipulation of perception, producing outcomes that exceeded the scale of their forces. Systematic planning, procedural discipline, and iterative refinement ensured operational effectiveness, even in challenging and unpredictable environments. These documented practices illustrate the fully operationalized role of shinobi in Sengoku warfare, setting a precedent for the integration of covert action into comprehensive military doctrine. Not all missions succeeded, and operational risk shaped both training and strategy, highlighting the necessity of contingency planning and adaptive techniques in the continuing evolution of shinobi practice. Secrecy carried lethal consequences. The covert nature of shinobi operations during the Sengoku period came with inherent risks: exposure, capture, and execution. The very techniques that enabled stealth and infiltration also amplified vulnerability when missions failed or were compromised. Historical records highlight the high stakes and strict penalties associated with operational failure. Documented accounts from war chronicles, estate archives, and temple records illustrate instances of captured operatives. When detected, operatives faced interrogation, execution, or enslavement, with consequences extending to families or local communities in some cases. These measures underscore the gravity with which both daimyō and local authorities treated breaches of operational security, reflecting a systemic approach to enforcement and deterrence. Operational failures occurred for multiple reasons. Patrols, environmental miscalculations, misinformation, or unforeseen defensive measures could expose infiltrators. Even minor errors, mistimed movements, misread terrain, or insufficient concealment were sufficient to compromise missions. Chronicles often emphasize that operational discipline, environmental awareness, and procedural adherence were critical to survival, demonstrating that failure was not random but correlated with training and execution. Historical correspondence and campaign reports also reveal formalized responses to exposure. Orders for punitive action were precise. Captured operatives were interrogated for intelligence, then executed or confined. Measures extended to prevent operational compromise, including the destruction of tools, documents, and concealed routes. This systemic approach reflects the seriousness with which authorities managed covert risk and maintained operational secrecy, emphasizing that failure had strategic as well as personal consequences. Environmental factors further complicated operations. Mountain passes, dense forests, and river valleys could conceal movement but also isolate operatives from support. In adverse weather or unfamiliar terrain, the probability of detection increased. Archaeological and topographical studies of Sengoku-era operational zones corroborate textual accounts, demonstrating how terrain simultaneously enabled and constrained covert action. The psychological dimension of risk is also evident. Chronicles describe heightened vigilance, stress, and anxiety among operatives aware that failure could result in execution. These conditions required not only physical and cognitive competence but also emotional resilience. Training and apprenticeship included risk management, situational assessment, and contingency planning, emphasizing anticipation of potential exposure and strategic withdrawal when necessary. Failure also had broader operational consequences. Exposure of one operative could compromise entire networks, reveal intelligence channels, and prompt countermeasures by opposing forces. Documentation indicates that teams implemented compartmentalization and redundancy to mitigate systemic risk. Multiple operatives might perform overlapping reconnaissance or reconnaissance feint missions to ensure continuity of intelligence flow even if one member was captured. These strategies illustrate a sophisticated understanding of operational resilience within decentralized networks. By the early Edo period, increasing centralization and the consolidation of political authority reduced the frequency and strategic necessity of high-risk covert operations. The lethal consequences for failed missions reinforced the appeal of written doctrine, standardized training, and controlled deployment. Historical evidence shows that semi-autonomous employment models and unregulated operational freedom declined, replaced by more structured oversight and integration into formalized military hierarchies under the Tokugawa shogunate. In conclusion, exposure, operational failure, and associated punishment highlight the inherent risks of shinobi activity. Success depended on discipline, procedural rigor, environmental mastery, and strategic judgment. Historical records underscore that failure carried severe personal and operational consequences, influencing the evolution of training, doctrine, and network design. These documented experiences informed later codification, mitigating risk while preserving the effectiveness of covert operations. Centralization, rising political control, and institutionalized military authority would soon curtail many of the practices that had defined the autonomy and operational freedom of Sengoku-era operatives. Centralization under the Tokugawa shogunate would soon curtail semi-autonomous covert practices, transforming shinobi activity from operational necessity into codified, disciplined networks largely constrained by state oversight. Autonomy conflicted with unification. By the late 16th century, Oda Nobunaga sought to consolidate fragmented Japan under centralized authority. Semi-autonomous intelligence networks, particularly those in Iga and Kōga, presented a structural challenge. Their independence, operational competence, and capacity for disruption were incompatible with Nobunaga's strategic vision of control and uniform governance. Historical sources, including the Shinsho Koki and regional chronicles, describe Nobunaga's systematic assessment of potential threats to central authority. Iga and Kōga were noted for producing highly trained operatives capable of infiltration, sabotage, and targeted action across provincial boundaries. While these networks had historically served local daimyō or operated on temporary contractual arrangements, their skills, mobility, and knowledge of terrain rendered them potential spoilers for any campaign aimed at political unification. Economic and political considerations reinforced this imperative. Nobunaga's campaigns relied on coordinated taxation, controlled supply lines, and predictable loyalties among vassals. Semi-independent militias and covert operatives introduced uncertainty, creating potential avenues for disruption or resistance. Records of estate administration and taxation indicate that regions under Nobunaga's authority were prioritized for integration, standardization, and suppression of non-aligned power structures, highlighting the strategic logic behind confronting autonomous networks in Iga and Kōga. Military intelligence, previously a tool for regional advantage, became a potential instrument of obstruction. Iga operatives were known to assist opposing forces or exploit gaps in command structures, leveraging familiarity with terrain and fortifications. Nobunaga's advisors recognized that leaving such operatives unchecked risked compromise of campaigns, delays in sieges, and unforeseen reversals. As such, suppression was not driven by legend or personal animus but by calculated assessment of strategic risk. Archival accounts describe formal deliberations and reconnaissance preceding military action. Nobunaga's generals surveyed Iga's mountainous regions, assessed defensive capabilities, and evaluated operative networks. The combination of geographic intelligence and prior campaign reports informed the planning of decisive military interventions. This demonstrates that the suppression of Iga was a considered strategic operation, integrating conventional force with prior knowledge of covert operational networks. The centralization imperative also reflected broader shifts in Japanese warfare. As unification progressed, semi-autonomous military practices became increasingly incompatible with emerging hierarchies. Whereas the Sengoku period rewarded decentralized initiative, Nobunaga's model prioritized disciplined command, standardization of tactics, and predictable adherence to orders. Independent operatives, no matter how skilled, were outside the chain of command and could not be reliably controlled, rendering them systemic liabilities. Contemporary correspondence and campaign diaries indicate that Nobunaga's assessment included both direct threat evaluation and preventive planning. Operatives in Iga were considered capable of mobilizing quickly, conducting cross-domain operations, and evading detection in complex terrain. These capabilities, historically advantageous in fragmented regional conflicts, now posed direct challenges to Nobunaga's centralized war strategy. Two additional observations arise. First, the very effectiveness of Iga and Kōga operatives, honed over generations, made them exceptional but politically dangerous. Second, Nobunaga's intolerance for autonomous military networks reflects a consistent strategic principle. Consolidation of authority requires suppression of independent centers of power that could act outside formal hierarchies. In this context, action against Iga was both defensive and preemptive, aimed at removing potential disruption before it could affect unification campaigns. By the late 1570s, this tension between autonomous networks and centralized ambition crystallized into deliberate planning for military intervention. Nobunaga's assessment combined operational intelligence, geographic analysis, and political calculation, setting the stage for one of the most consequential campaigns against shinobi communities in Japanese history. Strategic intolerance, informed by empirical evaluation of risk, drove the decision to confront semi-autonomous operatives directly, signaling a decisive shift from regional tolerance to systematic suppression. In conclusion, Iga and Kōga's autonomy conflicted with Nobunaga's objectives of political and military unification. Their operational independence, mobility, and specialized skills represented structural threats that could not be reconciled with centralized governance. Historical evidence demonstrates that Nobunaga's strategy was grounded in assessment of tactical capability, systemic risk, and administrative coherence. The inherent tension between autonomy and centralization precipitated decisive military action, marking a critical inflection point in the trajectory of shinobi practice. This strategic tension directly led to military campaigns targeting Iga, culminating in operations designed to neutralize autonomous intelligence networks and integrate, or eliminate, their capabilities under centralized authority. Superior numbers overcame local expertise. Between 1579 and 1581, Oda Nobunaga initiated a series of military operations aimed at subjugating the semi-autonomous Iga region. Although Iga operatives were renowned for stealth, knowledge of terrain, and unconventional tactics, the overwhelming coordination, manpower, and logistical resources of Nobunaga's forces ultimately imposed decisive control. Military chronicles, including the Shincho-koki and regional temple records, document multiple incursions preceding the decisive campaign. Initial skirmishes tested Iga's defensive capabilities, with reports noting the effective use of ambushes, night raids, and counterintelligence by local operatives. The terrain, mountainous, forested, and crisscrossed with narrow passes, amplified the defenders' advantage, enabling them to delay and disrupt superior forces despite numerical inferiority. Nobunaga's forces responded with careful planning, integrating reconnaissance, coordination between multiple contingents, and strategic allocation of siege resources. Campaign orders emphasized simultaneous movement along multiple axes, preemptive control of supply routes, and systematic elimination of fortified positions. These records highlight a disciplined, hierarchical approach that contrasted with the ad hoc but adaptive tactics of IGA operatives. Contemporary accounts describe both the human and material cost of the campaign. Casualty reports and temple records indicate that large numbers of operatives, civilians, and local militias were killed or displaced. Fortifications were systematically destroyed, supply caches seized or burned, and pathways through the mountains controlled to prevent further insurgent activity. These actions reflect a strategic logic aimed not merely at battlefield victory but at the permanent suppression of autonomous operational capability. Archaeological evidence supports textual accounts. Excavations in IGA reveal scorched settlement layers, dismantled defensive works, and artifacts associated with the rapid displacement of populations. These findings corroborate contemporary descriptions of systematic campaign methodology, illustrating the operational reality of military domination and the practical limitations of localized, irregular resistance against a numerically superior force. The campaigns also illustrate adaptive responses by IGA operatives. Chroniclers report that infiltrators and small raiding parties attempted sabotage, diversion, and intelligence collection to hinder the invaders' advance. While tactically effective in isolated encounters, these measures ultimately could not sustain strategic advantage. The juxtaposition of local ingenuity against organized hierarchical force underscores the evolving relationship between irregular practitioners and centralized military power. Logistical and strategic planning played a decisive role. Nobunaga's commanders secured supply lines, coordinated multi-pronged advances, and utilized intelligence to preempt ambushes. Coordination between infantry, cavalry, and siege specialists neutralized defensive strongpoints, while persistent pressure exhausted IGA's capacity for prolonged resistance. Historical records demonstrate that even highly mobile and terrain-savvy operatives were vulnerable to systemic operational dominance when isolated or outnumbered. The aftermath of the campaigns had enduring consequences. Nobunaga's victory effectively dismantled IGA's autonomous military structures, curtailed independent shinobi activity in the region, and incorporated survivors into controlled military service. Textual records indicate that some operatives were absorbed into daimyō armies, while others fled to neighboring provinces, dispersing operational knowledge but reducing coordinated capacity. This dispersal, coupled with systematic suppression, marked a turning point in the operational autonomy of shinobi networks. In conclusion, the IGA campaigns of 1579 to 1581 illustrate the limitations of localized, autonomous intelligence networks when confronted by numerically superior and systematically organized forces. Despite tactical skill, operational knowledge, and environmental mastery, IGA operatives could not withstand the strategic pressure exerted by Nobunaga's centralized military apparatus. Contemporary records and archaeological evidence together confirm the effectiveness of combined planning, logistical dominance, and disciplined execution, providing a clear example of the intersection between irregular warfare and centralized authority during Japan's unification process. The consequences of these campaigns were lasting. The suppression of autonomous shinobi networks, dispersal of operatives, and absorption into regulated military structures set the stage for Tokugawa-era oversight and codification of covert operations. Suppression did not erase knowledge. The decisive campaigns against IGA operatives dismantled local autonomy, yet their specialized skills, tactical expertise, and procedural know-how persisted, dispersing into new social and military contexts across Japan. Historical records demonstrate that the strategic value of shinobi knowledge ensured its survival even after the destruction of semi-autonomous networks. Contemporary chronicles and estate documents indicate that surviving operatives sought employment under regional daimyō outside IGA. Their skills in reconnaissance, sabotage, infiltration, and intelligence gathering made them highly desirable assets for rulers seeking competitive advantage. Employment was typically contractual and temporary, reflecting a continuity of semi-autonomous operational culture, even within more regulated frameworks. This dispersal facilitated the geographic diffusion of specialized techniques across multiple provinces. Archaeological and textual evidence corroborates these patterns. Contractual documents, payroll records, and letters of employment reference the presence of IGA-trained operatives in provinces such as Ekizan, Mikawa, and Kai. Chronicles note their participation in reconnaissance missions, intelligence gathering, and tactical support roles within conventional armies. Material culture, including climbing tools, concealed blades, and specialized equipment, appears in these contexts, suggesting the continuity of practical training beyond the original IGA milieu. Integration into conventional military structures did not entirely subsume independence. Some operatives maintained networks of contacts in neighboring domains, enabling intelligence sharing, rapid mobility, and coordinated covert action. These informal connections served as extensions of the Iga and Kōga operational philosophy, reinforcing the resilience of skill sets even as formal autonomy declined. Evidence from correspondence and campaign reports suggests that such networks contributed to regional military effectiveness while remaining largely invisible to central authorities. Historical records also note the selective absorption of operatives into Tokugawa-aligned structures. Survivors with demonstrable loyalty, technical skill, and reliability were integrated into local garrison duties, intelligence roles, or administrative positions supporting centralized governance. This process represents both a containment strategy and a pragmatic utilization of expertise. The state neutralized independent centers of covert power while harnessing operative capabilities for sanctioned purposes. Two additional observations arise from this phase. First, dispersal reinforced the standardization and codification of operational knowledge. Apprenticeship, manuals, and mentorship facilitated continuity of technique and doctrine, ensuring that specialized skills were preserved despite organizational fragmentation. Second, the integration of dispersed operatives into conventional hierarchies illustrates an early form of institutionalization. Covert knowledge became a controlled resource, embedded within regulated military frameworks rather than practiced independently. Social and economic factors shaped the absorptive process. Surviving operatives had to navigate local loyalties, contractual obligations, and political constraints while maintaining functional expertise. Temple archives and estate records describe agreements outlining obligations, compensation, and operational expectations, reflecting both the value of skills and the caution exercised by employers in managing potentially disruptive actors. These arrangements facilitated controlled application of shinobi knowledge while minimizing risks of unsanctioned action. The dispersal of operatives also had long-term pedagogical effects. Skills transmitted through apprenticeship and oral instruction contributed to the development of regional martial traditions that incorporated reconnaissance, infiltration, and sabotage techniques into broader military education. Manuals and oral histories compiled in the early Edo period reflect this transmission, demonstrating continuity of procedural doctrine and practical knowledge beyond the immediate Iga and Kōga context. By the early 17th century, dispersed shinobi networks were largely subordinated to centralized authority. Nonetheless, their methods influenced both the training of retainers and the institutional approach to intelligence gathering within the Tokugawa system. Operational expertise persisted in modified form. Reconnaissance, counterintelligence, and clandestine observation became regulated functions within formal hierarchies, ensuring that valuable knowledge survived even as independent practice diminished. In conclusion, the post-IGA dispersal of shinobi operatives illustrates the resilience and adaptability of specialized military knowledge. Suppression destroyed local autonomy but did not eliminate procedural skill. Historical evidence shows that survivors were absorbed into new social and military contexts, transmitting expertise through apprenticeship, employment, and integration into regulated hierarchies. This dispersal ensured the survival, adaptation, and eventual institutionalization of shinobi knowledge, bridging the late Sengoku period and the controlled military structures of the Tokugawa era. The absorption and controlled deployment of shinobi knowledge under the Tokugawa shogunate transformed independent practice into regulated intelligence functions, formalizing previously autonomous methods within the emerging centralized state. Peace reshaped intelligence. The establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate in 1603 marked a fundamental shift in Japan's political and military landscape. With centralized authority firmly established and major inter-daimyō warfare largely eliminated, the operational context that had previously sustained semi-autonomous shinobi networks ceased to exist. Battlefield espionage, once a critical strategic function, declined sharply as conventional military engagement became rare and predictable. Historical records, including Tokugawa administrative documents and regional chronicles, indicate a profound reduction in active conflict between provinces. The shogunate's policies of sankenkotai, strict territorial governance, and suppression of armed uprisings ensured internal stability. The frequency, scale, and unpredictability of combat that had characterized the Sengoku period no longer prevailed, diminishing the tactical demand for covert operatives to penetrate enemy fortifications or disrupt supply lines. Surviving accounts suggest that many former operatives were integrated into local bureaucracies or employed as retainers performing surveillance, courier, or counterintelligence duties. Letters, payroll records, and domain regulations document assignments that involved monitoring potential threats to local authority, maintaining confidentiality in administrative transactions, and reporting unusual activity within and across villages. These roles preserved elements of traditional shinobi expertise while adapting them to a non-combat context. Archaeological evidence and material culture further reflect the transformation. Specialized tools once optimized for infiltration, climbing, or sabotage appear in domestic and administrative contexts, suggesting adaptation for surveillance, reconnaissance of territory, and communication security. Manuals from the period indicate a shift toward methodical observation, documentation, and procedural rigor, emphasizing information management rather than direct military engagement. The decline in battlefield espionage also influenced pedagogy and organizational structure. Apprenticeship continued, but training emphasized literacy, record-keeping, and situational assessment over physical infiltration or combat skills. Strategic thinking, environmental awareness, and problem-solving remained core competencies, illustrating the adaptability of procedural doctrine to peacetime functions. The institutional continuity of knowledge was maintained through formalized instruction under domain authorities, ensuring that expertise persisted despite diminished operational necessity. Political control reinforced the transformation. The shogunate implemented regulatory frameworks to monitor, restrict, and direct the activities of former autonomous operatives. Permission for surveillance, intelligence collection, or protective assignments was granted by local magistrates or daimyō, reflecting centralized oversight. Documents indicate that unsanctioned covert action was severely penalized, reducing the risk of rogue operations and integrating shinobi practice into a predictable, state-approved system. Two additional observations arise from this period. First, the transformation underscores the flexibility of procedural knowledge. Covert techniques did not disappear but were adapted to serve governance and administrative stability rather than military conquest. Second, the Tokugawa period illustrates how systemic change, here, sustained peace, reconfigures operational roles. Functions that were previously vital to survival and strategic success were transformed into regulated contributions to civil order. Despite the overall reduction in battlefield espionage, some residual military assignments persisted in preparation for potential rebellions or external threats. Records document limited intelligence activities related to border security, monitoring of vassals, and verification of loyalty within domains. While these assignments were constrained, they maintained core elements of reconnaissance, surveillance, and procedural rigor, reflecting the enduring relevance of specialized skills in a modified operational environment. In conclusion, the establishment of Tokugawa peace fundamentally reshaped the role of shinobi. The strategic demand for battlefield infiltration and sabotage disappeared, yet the procedural knowledge, environmental expertise, and observational skills of former operatives were preserved and redirected toward administrative, surveillance, and security functions. Historical records indicate that while the operational intensity of covert action declined, the institutionalization of expertise ensured continuity, laying the groundwork for regulated, state-aligned applications of traditional shinobi methods. With battlefield espionage largely obsolete, new roles emerged within Tokugawa governance. Operatives became observers, couriers, and localized intelligence agents, marking the transition from autonomous combat networks to controlled, state-directed functions. Observation replaced infiltration. Under Tokugawa rule, former operatives shifted from battlefield roles to structured functions within the state apparatus, focusing on surveillance, internal security, and administrative intelligence. The specialized skills of shinobi, once applied to disruption and reconnaissance in war, were systematically redirected to support governance and law enforcement. Administrative records, domain archives, and letters of appointment illustrate the integration of former Iga and Kōga operatives into local bureaucracies. These individuals were tasked with monitoring villages, ensuring compliance with taxation, verifying the loyalty of retainers, and reporting irregularities to magistrates or daimyō. Their assignments required discretion, meticulous observation, and procedural rigor, reflecting the adaptation of wartime competencies to peacetime administration. Evidence from payroll and personnel records confirms that operatives were formally compensated for their services. Contracts often specified responsibilities, reporting requirements, and jurisdictional limits, ensuring integration into legal and bureaucratic frameworks. This formal employment reduced independent action, centralizing control while preserving practical expertise. Local officials used these networks to supplement routine inspections, enforce ordinances, and preempt dissent, effectively transforming covert skill sets into instruments of governance. Archaeological and material evidence corroborates textual sources. Tools traditionally associated with infiltration, such as climbing implements, signaling devices, and observation equipment, appear repurposed for structured surveillance. Manuals from the early Edo period describe systematic observation methods, information recording, and the secure transmission of reports, demonstrating a formalized approach to internal security. These sources highlight the continuity of methodology, even as operational goals shifted from military conquest to civil oversight. Operational procedures emphasized discretion and minimal disruption. Unlike wartime missions designed to destabilize, tasks under Tokugawa oversight prioritized subtlety, accuracy, and timeliness of reporting. Field reports and magistrate correspondence indicate that operatives were trained to observe without engagement, corroborate findings through multiple sources, and maintain confidentiality to prevent false information from undermining governance. These methods illustrate the procedural continuity of shinobi skills within a radically different operational context. The transition to state intelligence also shaped public perception. Whereas Sengoku-era accounts highlighted daring raids, sabotage, and battlefield audacity, Tokugawa-era references present shinobi as administrative agents, often anonymized within records to emphasize their procedural role rather than individual skill. This reframing reflects the shift from independent, semi-mythic actors to standardized, accountable personnel within the emerging bureaucratic state. Two additional observations emerge. First, the structured deployment of operatives contributed to political stability by enabling early detection of unrest, irregularities, or potential rebellion. Second, their integration demonstrates a deliberate appropriation of martial expertise. The state converted autonomous capability into controlled intelligence capacity, preserving valuable knowledge while minimizing the risk of unsanctioned activity. This reflects a consistent Tokugawa principle of centralization, regulation, and risk mitigation. Despite these changes, vestiges of traditional training persisted. Observational acuity, environmental awareness, and procedural discipline continued to inform assignments. Apprenticeships and oral instruction maintained core skills, ensuring that knowledge accumulated over centuries remained operationally relevant. These practices allowed the shogunate to leverage inherited expertise without relying on ad hoc, semi-autonomous networks that had characterized previous centuries. In conclusion, during the Tokugawa period, shinobi evolved from battlefield specialists into state intelligence and police agents. Observation, surveillance, and administrative reporting replaced infiltration, sabotage, and open combat. Historical records demonstrate that operational skill sets were preserved, repurposed, and formalized under bureaucratic oversight. The transformation of autonomous covert networks into controlled intelligence apparatus illustrates how institutionalization and centralization reshaped the practice, function, and societal role of shinobi within early modern Japan. This redirection of function fundamentally altered public perception, codified operational doctrine, and ensured that shinobi knowledge endured within structured, state-approved frameworks, setting the stage for the final codification and documentation of methods during the Edo period. Knowledge survived without practice. As the Tokugawa period stabilized, the operational environment that had sustained shinobi skills, unpredictable warfare, political fragmentation, and autonomous networks, effectively disappeared. What remained were structured records, manuals, and apprenticeships that preserved technical and tactical knowledge, even as active covert operations became largely obsolete. Historical evidence shows that shinobi skills were increasingly codified and archived. Manuals such as the Bansenshuki, compiled 1676, and the Shininki, compiled 1681, collected practical instructions, procedural protocols, and strategic insights from prior generations. These texts were not merely prescriptive. They reflected the lived experience of operatives and represented systematic attempts to preserve knowledge for administrative or instructional purposes. Textual analysis demonstrates an emphasis on observation, risk assessment, communication, and environmental awareness, underscoring the procedural continuity of techniques despite the absence of frequent operational deployment. Archival records indicate that bureaucratization extended to apprenticeship, record-keeping, and structured instruction. Surviving documents describe formal training within domains, including observation of administrative routines, reporting protocols, and security procedures. Physical techniques, such as climbing, concealment, and mobility, were retained in practice drills but largely applied within controlled environments rather than in active missions. These measures ensured that skill sets remained transferable and preserved for future, regulated use. The decline in active practice did not erase skill. Rather, it shifted operational emphasis. Observational and analytical competencies were emphasized over direct action. Assignments involved intelligence gathering for governance, monitoring of retainers, and support for law enforcement, with operational complexity reduced in accordance with political stability. Manuscripts demonstrate that procedural discipline and cognitive training were prioritized, reflecting the bureaucratic embedding of formerly martial skills. Two additional observations emerge. First, codification served a dual function. It maintained historical continuity of practice while providing a framework for controlled deployment should circumstances require. Second, the bureaucratic embedding of shinobi knowledge reflects a broader pattern of institutional adaptation. Skills developed under conditions of political instability were systematically preserved and repurposed to align with centralized governance and civil administration. Archaeological and documentary evidence highlights the archival nature of practice. Tools, manuals, and records were maintained within administrative centers or private collections. Instruction emphasized documentation, accuracy, and procedural repetition over improvisation, demonstrating the transition from dynamic operational environments to structured, regulated knowledge repositories. Historical correspondence confirms that practitioners were increasingly engaged in oversight, instruction, and monitoring rather than field missions, reinforcing the decline of active covert operations. This period also marked the beginning of myth-making. As practical application declined, textual and oral transmission increasingly framed shinobi as exceptional or legendary figures. Storytelling, literary works, and later Edo period dramas began to exaggerate abilities, romanticize independence, and conflate historical operatives with archetypal ninja. The contrast between codified, bureaucratic knowledge and popular imagination laid the foundation for enduring myths that would diverge significantly from historical practice. In conclusion, the Tokugawa period witnessed the bureaucratization and gradual decline of shinobi practice. Operational necessity diminished, and skills were preserved primarily through manuals, apprenticeships, and controlled instruction. Historical evidence demonstrates a systematic effort to maintain technical and procedural knowledge within administrative and surveillance roles, even as active missions declined. Codification, archival preservation, and regulatory embedding ensured continuity of expertise, while transforming the social and operational role of shinobi. By the end of the 17th century, knowledge survived without regular practice, setting the stage for the transition from historical reality to cultural myth. With active covert operations largely obsolete and knowledge preserved in manuals and bureaucratic roles, historical practice gave way to legend, initiating the mythologization of shinobi in literature, drama, and popular culture. Entertainment filled historical silence. As active shinobi operations declined under Tokugawa rule, gaps in public awareness of covert military practice were increasingly filled by fiction, drama, and visual storytelling. Edo period literature, kabuki plays, and illustrated prints elevated the shinobi from disciplined administrator or sporadic operative to the realm of cultural archetype, emphasizing skill, cunning, and almost supernatural prowess. Textual analysis reveals that narrative embellishment was central to this process. Works such as Bansonshuki-inspired tales, serialized fiction, and kabuki dramas portrayed shinobi as extraordinary agents capable of infiltration, evasion, and assassination against overwhelming odds. These depictions often ignored historical context, geography, or administrative integration, prioritizing narrative tension and audience engagement. Chronicles of covert feats became dramatized set pieces, emphasizing suspense, disguise, and subterfuge over procedural accuracy. Visual media complemented textual narratives. Ukiyo-e prints, illustrated storybooks, and folding screens depicted shinobi in dynamic, stylized poses, often armed with exotic tools or performing acrobatic maneuvers. Artistic conventions emphasized anonymity, agility, and stealth, blending imagination with symbolic representation of martial expertise. While these images were not documentary, they codified aesthetic conventions that persisted into modern perception, establishing a visual language for the ninja archetype. Edo literature also selectively highlighted historical episodes. Stories frequently referenced Iga and Kōga, portraying the regions as crucibles of exceptional skill, while overlooking the structural, contractual, and administrative realities of historical operatives. Temporal compression and dramatization reinforced narrative clarity, presenting decades of procedural knowledge as concise, heroic exploits. This selective memory shaped public understanding of shinobi as inherently martial and legendary rather than primarily administrative or intelligence-oriented. Manuals and instructional texts interacted with popular culture in complex ways. While manuals such as the Bansonshuki and Shininki retained technical rigor and procedural fidelity, authors and compilers were aware of narrative appeal. Marginal annotations, illustrative diagrams, and stylized anecdotes sometimes emphasized dramatic application over operational frequency, reflecting a dual function: preserving historical practice for trained operatives while engaging a literate and curious audience. The socio-political context reinforced this cultural shift. Tokugawa peace reduced operational visibility of covert practices, creating a vacuum that literature and theater filled. Patrons, including urban merchants and provincial elites, encouraged consumption of stories that dramatized past exploits, blending historical kernels with imaginative elaboration. The result was a hybrid form of cultural memory, where the historical shinobi persisted as a professional operative in archival texts, but as a mythic figure in the public imagination. Despite exaggeration, Edo literature retained indirect fidelity to historical practice. Recurring themes such as espionage, infiltration, intelligence gathering, and the strategic use of terrain reflect enduring conceptual continuity. While narrative embellishment exaggerated frequency and impact, these thematic elements trace directly to Sengoku and Tokugawa-era operational principles, preserving a framework of methodology beneath mythic presentation. In conclusion, Edo period literature, theater, and visual culture played a central role in the cultural reinvention of shinobi. Popular imagination transformed practitioners from historical operatives into mythic figures of cunning and skill. While these representations diverged from documented practice, they maintained narrative traces of procedural and strategic expertise. Literature and art filled the informational vacuum left by bureaucratization and peacetime, establishing conventions that shaped public perception of shinobi for centuries. This popularized image, while exaggerated, was underpinned and reinforced by surviving manuals and instructional texts, which preserved selective memory and procedural knowledge, linking myth with historical practice and preparing the way for Edo-era codification. Documentation became interpretation. During the late Edo period, retrospective manuals codified shinobi knowledge while simultaneously shaping public perception, blending practical instruction with anecdotal and often romanticized accounts. Texts compiled decades after active covert operations emphasized both operational principles and narrative flair, creating a dual legacy of procedural guidance and myth. Primary sources include manuals such as the Bansen Shuki, 1676, the Shininki, 1681, and the later Ninpiden, mid-18th century. While these works retained detailed descriptions of surveillance, infiltration, and intelligence techniques, they were compiled in a context removed from frequent operational necessity. Authors relied on oral histories, apprenticeships, and prior manuals, filtering practical knowledge through retrospective interpretation. This process allowed emphasis on exemplary skill, strategic insight, and moral instruction, often elevating mundane tasks to narrative significance. The interplay between technical instruction and narrative embellishment is evident in both textual content and illustrative diagrams. Manuals detail observation techniques, environmental awareness, signaling, and stealth procedures, yet include episodic examples of infiltration or sabotage that rarely align with contemporary operational frequency. These narratives functioned pedagogically, offering readers insight into application while simultaneously dramatizing historical precedent. The result was a layered text, part operational guide, part cultural storytelling. Retrospective manuals also contributed to regional prestige. Compilers often emphasized origins in Iga and Kōga, framing these areas as centers of unparalleled expertise. Historical context, such as contractual employment or administrative integration, was largely omitted or simplified. By presenting shinobi skills as concentrated, exceptional, and geographically iconic, these texts reinforced both educational utility for practitioners and cultural myth for broader audiences. Documentation simultaneously reflected and reinforced Edo period societal norms. Manuals often included moral guidance, emphasizing loyalty, discretion, and ethical conduct. While operationally pragmatic, these elements also shaped perception. The shinobi became a model of disciplined professionalism, blending practical skill with socially approved virtues. This fusion of technique and ethical framing influenced both apprenticeship training and the literary imagination, bridging historical practice with emerging cultural narratives. By the end of the Edo period, retrospective manuals were key agents of romanticization. While grounded in historical practice, their selective examples, dramatized incidents, and emphasis on extraordinary skill contributed to modern misconceptions. Later portrayals, whether in literature, kabuki, or global adaptations, drew upon these texts, interpreting procedural knowledge through the lens of adventure, heroism, and secrecy. The divergence between archival precision and popular narrative underscores the dual legacy of the period: preservation of technique alongside construction of myth. In conclusion, late Edo period manuals exemplify how documentation can simultaneously preserve and reinterpret knowledge. Operational routines were codified, apprentices trained, and procedural continuity maintained. Yet the narrative framing, selective memory, and illustrative embellishment introduced a romanticized vision of the shinobi that departed from historical reality. This dual function explains why modern perceptions of shinobi emphasize extraordinary skill, independence, and legend, attributes rooted in retrospective textual interpretation rather than active operational history. These texts not only preserved the technical knowledge of shinobi but also served as the foundation for globalized myths, shaping Western and modern interpretations centuries later and bridging the gap between historical practice and cultural iconography. History confirms function, not fantasy. A careful examination of primary sources, archaeological records, and contemporaneous documents demonstrates that shinobi were primarily tactical operatives and administrative agents, not the acrobatic, near-supernatural figures often portrayed in modern media. The historical record consistently emphasizes purpose, procedure, and strategic integration over spectacle. Textual evidence from chronicles, estate records, and Tokugawa manuals underscores operational reality. Campaign accounts, such as the Taihiki and local domain archives, describe reconnaissance, sabotage, intelligence gathering, and counterintelligence as routine components of Sengoku-era warfare. These activities were often contractual, employing local specialists temporarily rather than maintaining a permanent, independent class. The emphasis was functional. Scouts and operatives performed defined roles within broader military or administrative structures, with accountability to samurai commanders or domain officials. Archaeological discoveries support this interpretation. Excavated climbing tools, signaling devices, and compact weapons correspond with tasks documented in manuals and operational records. Settlement patterns, defensive fortifications, and terrain analysis from Iga and Kōga reveal a pragmatic adaptation to geography, emphasizing mobility, concealment, and local knowledge. These material findings corroborate textual descriptions, illustrating how environmental and socio-political factors shaped covert operations. The linguistic record further clarifies historical practice. Terms such as shinobi no mano and suppa, appearing in 13th to 14th century sources, refer to functional roles rather than hereditary or mystical status. Later appellations, including ninja, are retrospective and popularized, highlighting the divergence between contemporary terminology and modern cultural usage. Linguistic evidence reinforces the conclusion that operational identity was grounded in activity, not legend. Historical manuals, including the Bansenshuki and Shininki, corroborate operational priorities. They emphasize surveillance, environmental observation, communication protocols, and procedural discipline. While narrative elements occasionally dramatize missions, the core instructions reflect replicable methodology and pragmatic objectives. This alignment between textual prescription and documented activity provides strong evidence for the functional, systematic nature of shinobi practice. Comparative analysis with contemporary intelligence practices reveals parallels. European and East Asian states employed scouts, spies, and local operatives in comparable roles, emphasizing observation, verification, and reporting. This contextualizes shinobi functions as part of broader historical patterns of early modern intelligence and covert operations, reinforcing interpretation grounded in function rather than myth. In conclusion, the historical record confirms that shinobi were purpose-driven operatives embedded within military and administrative structures. Archaeological, textual, and linguistic evidence converge to emphasize practical function. Reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, sabotage, and localized policing. Modern representations of acrobatics, supernatural skill, and mythic independence do not align with documented practice. By grounding analysis in verifiable sources, scholars can separate operational reality from narrative exaggeration, providing a clear, evidence-based assessment of shinobi history. While the evidence delineates operational reality, scholarly debate continues regarding the extent of autonomy, the evolution of techniques, and regional variation, necessitating further contextual assessment of legacy, perception, and cultural influence in subsequent sections. Absence of evidence shapes interpretation. Despite extensive archival and archaeological research, fundamental questions about the scale, organization, and operational autonomy of shinobi networks continue to provoke scholarly debate. Historians must navigate gaps in documentation, regional variation, and retrospective textual biases when reconstructing their historical role. A central point of contention concerns the number and scope of operatives. Contemporary sources rarely provide exact counts or systematic rosters. Estate records and campaign chronicles indicate employment of scouts and intelligence agents, yet the terminology and frequency of deployment are inconsistent. Some scholars argue that Iga and Kōga networks represented tightly coordinated, semi-professional organizations, while others interpret evidence as reflecting loosely connected, temporary alliances of local specialists. The ambiguity highlights the difficulty of quantifying operational reach in decentralized political contexts. Another debate concerns the degree of autonomy exercised by shinobi. Records of contractual employment, temporary assignments, and formal integration into samurai campaigns suggest that operatives were rarely independent agents. Yet oral traditions and later manuals often emphasize self-directed skill development and local decision-making. Scholars debate whether this represents historical independence or retrospective embellishment. Linguistic analysis indicates that terms such as shinobi no mano referred to role-based functions rather than personal identity, further complicating interpretation. The reliability of retrospective manuals introduces additional complexity. Texts like the Bansenshuki and Shininki were compiled decades after the events they describe, combining operational instruction with anecdotal narrative. While these sources preserve procedural knowledge, their interpretive framing can exaggerate effectiveness, agency, or heroism. Historians must differentiate between methodological content and narrative embellishment when assessing historical practice. Comparative analysis across Japan reveals significant regional variation. Iga and Kōga are often treated as paradigmatic centers, yet evidence from other provinces suggests that intelligence and covert operations were widespread, though less formalized. The concentration of documentation in certain areas may reflect preservation bias rather than unique operational sophistication. This challenges monolithic conceptions of shinobi as exclusive to a few districts. Furthermore, historiographical interpretation continues to evolve. Earlier scholarship often relied on popularized accounts or Edo period romanticization, inflating the role of supernatural skill or independence. Contemporary research emphasizes archival rigor, archaeological corroboration, and comparative methodology, highlighting the tension between legend and documented practice. Ongoing debate focuses on reconciling narrative tradition with empirical evidence, while acknowledging the persistence of regional, social, and procedural variability. In conclusion, scholarly debates concerning the scale, organization, autonomy, and impact of shinobi underscore the complexity of historical reconstruction. Absence of exhaustive records necessitates careful analysis of textual, archaeological, and linguistic sources, with attention to regional and temporal variation. While certain patterns, training, procedural discipline, contractual employment, and tactical specialization are supported, uncertainty remains regarding network structure, operational density, and degree of independence. These unresolved questions reflect the broader challenges of studying semi-formalized, context-dependent military practices in pre-modern societies. Despite these uncertainties, the influence of shinobi extends beyond the historical record, shaping both domestic cultural memory and international perceptions, bridging operational reality with enduring legacy that continues to inform modern media, scholarship, and cultural identity. Espionage followed universal principles. Across continents and centuries, societies confronted similar challenges: acquiring information, exploiting terrain, and influencing opponents without direct confrontation. Within this framework, shinobi exemplify the convergence of environmental adaptation, procedural skill, and strategic foresight, positioning them within a broader global history of intelligence. Analysis of historical records situates shinobi operations alongside other early intelligence systems. Comparable practices can be observed in European scouts and spies, Chinese military intelligence, and Middle Eastern reconnaissance networks. Common threads emerge: recruitment based on skill and local knowledge, temporary assignment rather than permanent status, and a combination of observation, infiltration, and reporting. These features highlight operational universals, underscoring that Japanese covert operatives were neither anomalous nor culturally isolated, but rather part of a global pattern of tactical adaptation to political fragmentation. Archaeological and textual evidence further demonstrates systemic principles in shinobi practice. Manuals such as the Bansenshuki and the Shininki codified surveillance, signaling, environmental exploitation, and information management. Historical campaigns reveal coordinated operations, contingency planning, and risk assessment, reflecting structured approaches to intelligence rather than improvisational or legendary activity. Procedural emphasis ensured reliability and continuity, a hallmark shared with contemporaneous intelligence traditions worldwide. Moreover, shinobi highlight the evolution from ad hoc operations to systematic knowledge preservation. While active field deployment declined under Tokugawa peace, manuals, apprenticeships, and procedural codification ensured that intelligence principles survived. This transition mirrors broader trends in global history, where periods of conflict often give rise to formalized techniques and educational transmission, preparing societies for potential future crises. The historiographical significance of shinobi lies in both practice and perception. Accurate, evidence-based scholarship emphasizes operational function, organizational networks, and environmental adaptation, while popular culture emphasizes legend and spectacle. Understanding this duality provides a framework for evaluating intelligence history. The utility of skills persists irrespective of mythic embellishment, reinforcing the value of empirical analysis in reconstructing historical practices. Comparative assessment also situates shinobi within modern historiography of intelligence. Studies of early modern Europe, China, and the Islamic world identify analogous patterns of recruitment, temporary service, and procedural codification. These parallels suggest that Japanese operatives represent one iteration of a universal response to strategic uncertainty. Societies develop systems for gathering and exploiting information that maximize advantage without relying solely on open force. Shinobi exemplify these principles in a uniquely Japanese context, bridging local adaptation with global operational logic. In conclusion, shinobi occupy a defined place in the history of intelligence. Archaeological, textual, and comparative evidence demonstrates that their functions, reconnaissance, infiltration, sabotage, and administrative surveillance, embodied universal principles of covert operations. While popular imagination has romanticized their role, the historical record affirms systematic practice rooted in environment, social structure, and strategic necessity. Understanding shinobi in this context situates them within both Japanese history and the broader development of global intelligence, providing a grounded, academic perspective on their enduring significance. By tracing shinobi from environmental origins through Sengoku warfare, Tokugawa codification, and global mythologization, history confirms their role as skilled, adaptive intelligence operatives. Their legacy persists not only in literature and media but also as a case study in the evolution of strategic information gathering, demonstrating that the principles of espionage transcend culture and endure across time. Before we close this exploration of shinobi history, consider subscribing to Nightfall History to continue uncovering the hidden structures, strategies, and stories that shaped civilizations. Click the bell icon to receive daily documentaries and join a community dedicated to rigorous, cinematic, and evidence-based historical storytelling. Share your thoughts in the comments. Which revelation about the shinobi surprised you most, or challenged the myths you thought you knew?